So I'm here with Peter Levenda, the author of Sinister Forces, Secret Machines, The Unholy Alliance, and many other books.
If we have a crash saucer from the 40s, I would say if we are in possession of it and they're in possession of it too, then there is an agreement between countries that says we're not going to talk about this. It's the Fight Club.
JFK was assassinated over, quote-unquote, the alien presence.
E. Howard Hunt, on his deathbed, did claim that there was a conspiracy to kill Kennedy, that he knew about it. I mean, everybody that represents the blue-blooded Brahmins of American society, old money people, were at a seance, a freaking seance, in the woods in Maine on New Year's Eve.
What is the Necronomicon? And why is the Strategic Air Command interested in the Necronomicon?
How much time do you have? At some point, somebody did something they weren't supposed to do. It might have jump-started civilization on this planet.
Today's episode is sponsored by Incogni. If you think the government keeps secrets, wait until you meet data brokers. They know where you live, who you voted for, which furniture you bought for your house, and which UFO videos you've rewatched 3 times at 2 a.m. last night. That's because every click, form, and purchase builds a quiet dossier on you, then gets sold, repackaged, and sold again. It's like there's a shadow version of you living inside a server farm somewhere in New Jersey. That's why I personally use Incogni. It automatically hunts down those data brokers, over 250 of them, and forces them to delete your information. Then it keeps checking back until they actually do. And the new custom removals feature, if you find your data on any site, you just paste the link into your dashboard and Incogni wipes it for you. You get unlimited takedowns. It's not a VPN. It's not going incognito. This is a full-scale data exfiltration in reverse, the cleanest form of digital hygiene you can practice. So if you care about privacy, autonomy, or just don't want to be the training data for the next AI overlord, get Incogni. Use code AmericanAlchemy at checkout or go to incogni.com/AmericanAlchemy for 60% off an annual plan. Again, that's incogni.com/AmericanAlchemy and code AmericanAlchemy for 60% off your annual plan. So I'm here with Peter Levenda, who I couldn't be more honored to be with. I think you are an amazing big picture thinker who kind of consumes all of the data around non-human intelligence, UFOs, but also connects them with ancient traditions and religion and mysticism in a super unique way, and in a way that's caught the attention of higher ups in the government. And you've also just led just a fascinating life. And so I'm really excited for you to be here today. You're the author of Sinister Forces, Secret Machines, Man, Gods, and War, and The Unholy Alliance, and many other books. And so, yeah, thank you for being here.
I appreciate it. Thanks very much for having me. This is great.
Absolutely. So I want to start with this idea that reality itself might be somewhat choreographed or scripted, an idea you explore in Sinister Forces. You talk about all these kind of interesting synchronicities where things are written about or talked about before they happen. Do you want to explore any sort of examples of that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is something that occurred to me when I was, really in the very beginning of the Sinister Forces research, which goes all the way back to Watergate, right? So I started during Watergate. For those of you too young to know what I'm talking about, this was this, break-in of the Democratic Party national headquarters ordered by Nixon, and a whole thing that happened in the 1970s. In 1972, and then it lasted till 1975, the investigations and all of this. And I was following all of this. I was reading 3 newspapers a day. And I was living in New York, which is where I'm from. And so you're getting a lot of media attention. You're getting a lot of analysis. A lot of, people are showing up and they're talking about their backgrounds. And as I'm going through all this, I'm thinking, this is just weird. There's something about this that sort of defies regular analysis of, political systems. There's something else at work. And I started pulling at the threads of it. And I think one of the fascinating things that happened, I was starting to research Nazi occultism, because that was going to be a chapter of Sinister Forces. The idea that governments and religion could somehow get together in such a way as to cause this bend in reality, kind of, where it's not just, government running people's lives anymore from a purely mundane situation. And it's not the churches from a purely spiritual one. It's like this weird mix of both of them, and what kind of trouble could you possibly get into doing that? So I started, looking at that, and I wound up at the National Archives in DC, and I rented a room in a low-cost kind of hotel off DuPont Circle, and I'm in the room, and I bring my suitcase in, and I look up on the wall, and somebody had left this huge poster of, the eye in the pyramid, on top of the triangle of the pyramid. This Illuminati symbol was, like, hanging there, in the room where I'm starting to do this research. I'm thinking, "This is a little bit too on the nose," So, one thing led to another, and, it made me realize that there was something else going on, that what we were learning about Watergate was only really the tip of the iceberg. If you start pulling at the people who were involved, like E. Howard Hunt, right? Famous guy, former CIA officer, the action officer basically in charge of the Bay of Pigs operation, right? So he was down in Miami when all that was going on, trying to organize this invasion. That Kennedy eventually said, "No, we're not going to give you air support. You guys are freaking nuts, right? Pull back. Don't do this stuff." But they ignored him, right? Did all this thing. E. Howard Hunt wrote at least 3 occult novels.
Really?
Yeah. And he lived on a place called Witch's Island.
What?
So I'm thinking, well, wait a minute here, right?
Yeah.
Let me read the novels. Maybe there's something there. Who does that, right?
Yeah.
I just said, I want to read these novels. And oh my God, it's an attack on the Kennedys as Satan worshipers, thinly veiled kind of
Really?
of a story about that. The vitriol that he had for the Kennedys over Bay of Pigs was palpable in this. And he made them, Satan worshipers and stuff. It was really cool. So I said, I got to pay attention to Howard Hunt a little bit more closely. Okay. Years go by. It's now 1979, 1980, and I get a job. I'm working for a living as a regular human being, So I get a job in this strange company in Queens, New York, within walking distance of where I was living, which made it, nice. I could just walk to work. In New York, nobody walks to work. So I'm walking to this place, and, I have a desk next to this guy. And this guy in this tiny little company in the middle of nowhere turns out to have been E. Howard Hunt's colleague at the front that they worked for in Washington, D.C. Okay. So this guy is working there.
What was the front?
Well, the front was Robert Mullen Corporation. It was like a kind of a Mormon operation in D.C. that was supposedly a public relations firm. But E. Howard Hunt had his official office there, even though he was no longer quote unquote CIA, but he was operating here. He was part of the plumbers at that time. So Gordon Liddy, everybody was one big happy family. This guy had the office next to him. Also CIA, also operating as a front, except this guy was based either in Brazil for a long time or in Singapore, right? So all these things, I'm right there, right next to the guy who knows personally E. Howard Hunt, and I'm researching E. Howard Hunt. And he tells me his name. Arthur Hochberg. I guess I can tell his name now because I've talked about it. I printed it. And I went home after he started telling me his whole life story. He's going into CIA. He's going into this. He's going into that. The languages, because we both spoke a little Mandarin. He spoke better than I did. And so there was this immediate connection on that basis. And then slowly he just reveals that this was his position. So I go home, I'm going through all my books, and there's his name, right? And no one knew what had happened to him. And there he was in this tiny firm, right? Having lost his job at CIA.
That's amazing.
Because of the admiral. When the admiral came in after Watergate and all this stuff, they fired a lot of action agents, right? A lot of the officers who were actually in the field got fired. It's a big scandal, and so this guy lost his job, right? So I'm working with next to him for like 3 months. He's telling me stories and stuff. And I'm thinking, holy, and here I am researching this.
Yeah.
Right. This is not possible. Like if you had been a journalist and you were desperately looking for this guy, you wouldn't have found him.
Yes.
Right. But here I am next to him, and he's like driving me home in his car.
Yeah.
And we're parked in front, and he's talking about AFIO, right? The Association of Former Intelligence Officers. And then later I get invited to an AFIO thing like 10 years later. Right?
Yes.
So this would happen to me all the time.
There's something that happens, I think, when you set your attention on something that is somehow entropy reducing.
Exactly.
And it attracts more and more of that thing into your life. And it's hard to say whether that is some sort of retrocausal relationship a la some future that's already sort of set or something. But that's so fascinating. And I was just thinking, E. Howard Hunt, his lawyer, Douglas Caddy, told dark journalist, somewhat recently, that JFK was assassinated, because E. Howard Hunt is obviously implicated as much as any agent in the JFK assassination itself.
Sure.
And this guy Douglas Caddy said that E. Howard Hunt told him essentially I think as he was dying, that JFK was assassinated over, quote unquote, the alien presence.
Mm-hmm.
And so do you think that E. Howard Hunt knew about, NHI and aliens, and that JFK's assassination had something to do with that?
Well, I mean, I like to work with tangible stuff like documents and, stuff like that. That's as tangible as you're going to get in a situation like that, I believe. I don't really know if I 100% trust it or believe it. I know that E. Howard Hunt on his deathbed did claim that there was a conspiracy to kill Kennedy, that he knew about it, and that CIA was somehow involved, or at least a branch or a rogue element of CIA. I will pretty much accept that as a distinct possibility, right? Since the beginning, everybody has thought that, right? Because of Bay of Pigs. There was this, what happened with Watergate? There was all the same Bay of Pigs guys, right? The same ones who were involved with Bay of Pigs, the same anti-Castro Cubans now show up in Washington burglarizing the Democratic National Committee. So, yeah, there's a connection. I'm sure there is, right? Who you can take to court over this, I'm not sure.
Can I weave something together? And I don't know if this is the case, but Nixon was head of the 5412 Commission under Eisenhower.
Right.
And he used to task Howard Hughes with things so the 5412 Commission was already created as this interagency kind of coordination body that would give the president plausible deniability on sort of bad things that, he wanted to do domestically.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you had this other separation layer where Nixon would task Howard Hughes with doing the really dirty stuff. And so there's this idea that you had these kind of Cuban assassins. They called them the S-Force, or, they went by different names, Alpha 66, and, Operation Mongoose had something to do with this.
Right.
So he created that originally to take out Castro and Che Guevara. But that sort of, didn't end up happening. Obviously, you had the Bay of Pigs. JFK takes over from Eisenhower, and the narrative I've heard is that JFK, fires Dulles. Dulles is sort of licking his wounds and really angry at JFK and the Brown Brothers Harriman, and reoperationalizes this S-Force to then take out JFK himself. And what's really crazy is this connects to Watergate, because Howard Hughes' longtime lawyer, or I think general counsel, or, kind of right-hand guy, was a guy named Larry O'Brien. Larry O'Brien was running McGovern's campaign, and he was the guy whose cell phone got bugged in the Watergate scandal. So it's this crazy, and it's because you have to ask, why, if you're Nixon, why would you ever break into the DNC when you're way ahead of McGovern in the polls?
Yeah.
And obviously Nixon was notoriously paranoid. And so maybe it's because you have this guy, Larry O'Brien, who knows that you commissioned originally this S-Force team of assassins, and then they got operationalized to take out your longest political opponent, even though he didn't want JFK dead. Of course, he would never, do something like that, but he was probably afraid that it would get pinned on him. So it's pretty nuts. It's this crazy story.
But everybody knows everybody else. The problem that I have is that it gets tighter and tighter and tighter. And it's the same thing with the Nine, this famous thing that I talk about in Sinister Forces, right? You have these disparate individuals. You think they have nothing in common, nothing to do with each other. And then you pull at a certain thread and they all come together. Right?
So tell us who are the Nine?
Well, it actually connects to this whole story too, in its own way. So you have the Nine. Of course, this was in 1952 to 1953. There's this famous guy, not famous yet at the time, Andrija Puharich, a guy with medical training and technical training. He's involved in technology, for medical purposes and stuff. But he also gets involved with a bunch of sort of borderline psychic people, right? Back in the late 40s, early 50s, there were seances and there was psychic phenomena research and stuff going on. J.B. Rhine was doing his thing, studying ESP. And so you have a guy like Puharich who finds himself up in the woods in Maine. He was supposed to be back in the city. He was going to go to take up a position in California, I think. But he gets involved with these people. And to make a long story short, there's a seance that's held in late 52, early 53. I think it was the New Year's Eve of 52 to 53. And there are 9 people involved in the seance. Now, these are not just some casual 9 people you pick up like, your neighbors or something, right? This was a DuPont and an Astor and a Forbes. I mean, everybody that represents the blue-blooded Brahmins of American society, old money people, were at a seance, a freaking seance, right? In the woods in Maine on New Year's Eve. These people don't do New Year's Eve that way normally, right? There's big parties and there's champagne and there's God knows what. In this case, they're all sitting around a seance table with Andrija Puharich. And one of them is the guy who was the inventor of the Bell helicopter, right? So
Is that Arthur Young?
Arthur Young. So Arthur Young is there with his wife. His wife is Ruth Forbes Payne Young, right? She had a lot of names. She was excessively nomenclatured. And so you have, Ruth Forbes Payne Young. She's a Forbes. She was married to a George Payne, Lyman Payne, and also married to Arthur Young. So she had all of these pedigrees all mixed in together. And she was the best friend of, I think her name was Mary Douglas, if I'm not mistaken, who was the paramour of Allen Dulles. So Allen Dulles, which keeps coming up in these conversations, his girlfriend is the best friend of Ruth Young, married to Arthur Young. So already there's this weird connection, right? And when I say best friends, I mean they told each other everything. That kind of, it wasn't like a casual, thing. So they were best friends. And then you had a DuPont, you had an Astor, you had all of these people at the seance. And they're contacting some spiritual force. And there's a medium, a man from India, who then becomes kind of famous in sort of religious liberalism sort of circles, trying to, one world religion kind of thing, trying to make peace with everybody and all of this kind of stuff that was going on at the time. And so he's conducting the seance. And he's solving mathematical equations that Andrija Puharich puts to him to see if he's really talking to a spiritual force. And this guy's answering correctly, solving mathematical equations.
Whoa.
So then, and this guy evidently materializes out of the clear blue sky little threads, one for each of the members of this group. They're supposed to wrap around their wrist, makes them Brahmins, like actual Brahmins in the Indian sense. But they're Brahmins assigned to this exalted rank, this elite status, by these 9 forces that are spinning somehow above them, which later become identified as residents of a UFO in low Earth orbit, the same one that is later then being contacted by Uri Geller, who was then discovered by Puharich, brought to the United States to be tested. It gets incestuous. But Ruth and Arthur, they have a daughter who's also Ruth. Her name is Ruth Payne. She lives in Texas, by the way. And she's studying Russian. She's fascinated by the Russian language. She's a Quaker who wants to study Russian. Don't think she ever managed it in her life, but at that moment she wanted to study Russian. And in her home, she opens her door to some refugees, people who are recent immigrants from Russia. Lee Harvey Oswald and his wife, Marina, and their kids.
Whoa.
So they're living with Ruth Payne in this house in Texas.
So
she
wild.
gets him the job at the Texas School Book Depository.
So wild. So you have this kind of blue-blooded elite adjacent person whose mother engaged in the seance with Puharich, and they think of themselves as sort of guardians of the world via this like council of 9 non-humans or whatever.
Yeah.
And she is somehow housing Lee Harvey Oswald, where if you were to think of like an actor in history or agent who fundamentally shifts timelines in this dramatic way, I mean, he's got to be it.
He's got to be it, yeah.
So it's so wild.
So, and the thing is, she knows him. She goes on vacation a few months before the assassination and visits her in-laws, visits Arthur Young and his wife. Obviously, she discusses the fact that she has this Russian defector in her house, right?
Yeah.
We don't know all that was discussed, but we do know now we have scraps of correspondence that have survived between them after the assassination. And Arthur Young's wife is telling Ruth, her daughter-in-law, ixnay on the Oswald gate, right? Do not talk about this, anybody. Do not, get involved in this thing. You don't know how bad that's going to be for you. Distance yourself as much as possible. Don't give interviews, et cetera, right? So we know that there was a big discussion about this going on. So how is it that this happens? How is it, right, that this bunch of people having a seance in Maine in 1952 are 10 years later implicated in the assassination of the 20th century?
Seems like a level of coordination that is above the heads of all of the participants. Another example of that possibly is you talk about some of, kind of people who are interested in UFOs or involved directly in UFOs in the government also being related to the JFK assassination, showing up in those two places. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, that's what happened. That's when, going back to the original question you asked me, I realize I go around in circles. But, as Matthew McConaughey says, time is a spiral. So what we have is what got me involved in this, really involved in the UFO thing, because I really wasn't, from the beginning. I mean, I was kind of interested, like anybody would be interested, but not, to the extent that I would study it.
Yeah.
I'm going through the Warren Commission reports, the entire thing, not the summary, but all of the volumes.
Wow.
And I'm going through the Ruth Paine, the lady in Texas, the Quaker, studying Russian, and she's talking to the commission, and she's going how she met Lee Oswald and Marina and everything else. And then she starts talking about how, just before the assassination, she goes up to visit, Arthur Young and et cetera. At that point, Alan Dulles is part of that committee hearing. He stops her. He totally derails that story. And he makes a joke about something else completely unrelated and buries it. She was about to say that she was visiting Arthur Young and Ruth Forbes Payne Young, right, up there in Pennsylvania, and was going to, talk about this. And he cuts her off. You just read it and you say, what happened? It's like Kevin Costner reading the thing saying, ask the next question, right? Ask the question. Nobody ever asked the question. They don't follow up with her at all. This would have been a major story. Right?
Yeah. But there's also, don't you connect the Maury Island incident?
I'm getting there.
Okay, cool.
So that's what happened. I read that and I'm thinking, what the hell was that all about, right? So I pull on that thread. So I pull on the thread of Ruth Paine and I get to, Arthur Young and I get to the 9. I'm thinking, what the hell is this? And then, and then I'm looking at the report of Jim Garrison in New Orleans, right? And all that he's doing, and he's investigating these people. And one of the people he investigates is Fred Krisman. I'm thinking, wait a minute, I've heard that name before, right? Who the hell is Fred Krisman? And so I pull on that thread. It's Fred Krisman from Maury Island from 1947. And I pull on that and I come up with Guy Bannister, the same Guy Bannister who had an office in New Orleans that Lee Harvey Oswald worked out of, passing out those, Fair Play for Cuba leaflets. Right? So it was all in this one office. David Ferry, Jack Martin, all these psychos were in this one building with Guy Bannister. And Guy Bannister was the guy. He was the guy in the Pacific Northwest during 1947. During the whole UFO flap with Kenneth Arnold and Maury Island and all the rest of it. So he's up there, Guy Bannister. He's a member of the FBI, special agent. He's reporting back directly to Hoover by telex, which was a form of telegram, which was a form of email in those days, right? And they were mentioned, the designation was a special operation or special mission -X. It was the X-Files, right? The actual X-Files. And he's reporting on UFO sightings. That's his job. Guy Bannister's job is reporting on UFO sightings back to Hoover.
That's so fascinating. And I believe people think that Fred Krisman was one of, there were these 3 quote unquote hobos that were arrested.
Right.
And they think Fred Krisman was one of those hobos. I don't know if you corroborated that at all. But
I can't corroborate. In fact, he wasn't the only one. I mean, E. Howard Hunt might have been one of them as well. That was also a rumor that he was there in Dallas that day. And
Fred Krisman what is the Maury Island incident for people that aren't aware that there was actually more than one UFO incident in 1947.
Right. We always think of Roswell when we think of 47, but Roswell happened just slightly later. Initially, it was Kenneth Arnold. He was a pilot. I think he was with the Civil Air Patrol at the time, and he was flying some mission out in the Pacific Northwest in the Rockies, and he sees a flight of weird craft going at impossible speeds, and he describes them like saucers flying, dipping over skimming over the water, which gave rise into the flying saucer scenario. But his description of it was sort of a wing-shaped craft with a sort of a bite out of the end of it, the way he drew it, which is closer to the Horton design, which is a whole other story we can get into.
Yeah.
But anyway, so he came up with the idea of the flying saucer. He was the person who started the terminology inadvertently. So at the same time in Maury Island, which is in the same part of the world, in the upper Pacific Northwest, you had this very strange concept. There's a guy sitting in a boat in Puget Sound, and what appear to be UFOs of some kind are flying overhead, and one of them appears to be in distress. And it rains like shards of metal or slag or something all over his boat, a small boat, killing his dog, wounding his kid. His son is in the ship, and putting a hole in the ship. So he gets back and he talks to supposedly his boss. They're doing something in Puget Sound, and his boss is Fred Krisman. Now, Fred Krisman, it's really hard to find out his background. He's one of these guys with a very murky background. We believe he was OSS during the war, which was the forerunner of CIA. He seems to have known Clay Shaw, which was one of the reasons why Jim Garrison went after him. Clay Shaw and Fred Krisman seemed to have known each other well enough that Clay Shaw phoned him at the time that all of this was going on with the Jim Garrison and the Kennedy assassination.
Who's Clay Shaw?
Oh, who's Clay Shaw? Oh, Clay Shaw was the one guy that Jim Garrison brought to trial for the Kennedy assassination.
Okay.
If you know the movie JFK, Tommy Lee Jones plays Clay Shaw in that film. So he was the guy that was at the center of it, kind of a CIA funded guy. He had been a CIA contract agent for a while. He was not an actual CIA agent, but he was one of these people that got paid off by the agency to do things for them. We found that out after the trial, unfortunately, not before. So he beat the rap. He did not get acquitted. He did not get convicted. He was acquitted. But he knew Lee Harvey Oswald. He knew David Ferrie. He knew all the players in New Orleans. So he is arrested by Jim Garrison on his orders for having been involved in the Kennedy assassination. And evidently Clay Shaw calls Fred Krisman. So why, right?
Yeah.
So you're asking yourself, this is the guy that was involved in this seminal incident, and this is not over, right? So Fred Krisman then makes a few phone calls after his friend gets rained on by a UFO. And these phone calls wind up attracting the attention of the United States Air Force or the Army Air Force at the time. They were just transitioning to the Air Force. And two Air Force intelligence agents come and visit Fred Krisman and his partner, and Kenneth Arnold shows up, right? He's invited to this meeting, which is weird. And so all of these guys are meeting, I believe it's in Seattle, and they're all getting together to discuss this thing with the military. Like what happened, what did they see, and all the rest of it. I think that there's a lot of weirdness around that meeting. Kenneth Arnold did not have a reservation in any hotel. He just kind of showed up because Krisman said, why don't you come down? We're going to talk to these guys. And Arnold shows up, and there's no room at the inn until finally they get to the most expensive hotel in town, and they had a reservation already made for him. He didn't know about it. Turns out the place was bugged. Turns out a local journalist got a tape of the entire meeting, and he dies shortly thereafter, right? I mean, just too much weirdness around us.
Yes.
But in the end, Fred Krisman gives the Army guys a box of the slag to take back for analysis. This is like tremendous, right? This is UFO slag.
Yeah. Wow.
So they get back on their plane, and they're going to fly back to their base. Their plane explodes in midair.
No way.
So they die. The material is gone with them. There were survivors, but not the two guys who actually were there and took the information.
Whoa.
Not the guys who wrote the report, right? Whatever report existed. And everything was gone with them. And that was the first fatality that we know of in the 20th century UFO phenomenon era, were these two Air Force officers.
Alchemists, did you enjoy that? If you want the full picture, head over to the American Alchemy magazine we just launched on Substack. That's where we deep dive into all sorts of crazy topics that we don't have time to fit into every video, with weekly articles exploring all of the strange, forgotten, and conspiratorial corners of space, history, and high weirdness. So join up today at our free or paid tiers on Substack. I am including the full link in the description of this video. Such a wild story, and then such a weird connection that you have Fred Chrisman, who's reporting to Guy Bannister. They're running the X-Files and doing all UFO investigations, and then seems like Fred Chrisman has something to do with the JFK assassination. Just so weird. At least we know the Clay Shaw connection, and then maybe he was a hobo who was arrested on the scene. Right. It's just so strange. And then like you said, you have, I think the address was like 544 Camp Street in New Orleans, where you had all these guys kind of working together.
And they were bishops in a crazy church.
Well, so tell me about that.
Do you have time?
Oh, yeah. We got all the time in the world.
All right. So there's a crazy church. Okay. David Ferrie and Jack Martin belong to this crazy church. Okay. Jim Garrison could not figure out what the hell was the purpose of this church. Like, how did it fit into this whole thing? He knew that they were, ex-agents. They were running ops. They were white supremacists in many cases. David Ferrie certainly was. Guy Bannister certainly was. There was this whole white supremacist thing that was going through the assassination, starting with an attempt at the assassination in Florida by a white supremacist group. And then there was this group in New Orleans, right? And Guy Bannister was like this rabid anti-communist, as was David Ferrie. And so the rabid anti-communism got mixed up with all kinds of other stuff, right? So there was a church was headquartered in the Bronx, of all places, the American Orthodox Catholic Church, which was a big name for a very small church. The church was mostly clergy and no parishioners. There was actually no followers. Nobody actually went to these churches, right? It was just priests and bishops for the most part, mostly bishops, only a handful of priests. So it was a front. It was a front for something. And when the assassination took place, another bishop in Kentucky, a guy called Carl Stanley, calls the FBI directly and says, you got to look at David Ferrie and very important name, Jack Martin, although it's probably not his real name, as we turned out eventually. So you have these two guys, right? And they were both bishops under Carl Stanley, who was a renegade bishop who has a rap sheet a mile long and everything else, but he's running a church out of Kentucky. So Carl Stanley tells the FBI, look at these two guys in New Orleans. They're involved in the assassination. So the FBI then gets alerted, and they kind of look at these guys. They talk to them. These people are really crazy. We can't make heads or tails of this. We're dropping it. And then later, it gets picked up in New Orleans by the DA, right? So the district attorney, Jim Garrison, says we're going to now investigate these guys because there is something fishy, because Guy Bannister was very fishy, former FBI guy, long history in the FBI, retires from the FBI, opens up this operation on Camp Street in New Orleans. The building isn't there anymore. I checked a little while ago, unfortunately, but he was operating out of this building. And the Fair Play for Cuba leaflets that Lee Harvey Oswald was passing out had the address of Camp Street, the same address. So they're trying to figure out what the connection is here with all these guys, right? And Guy Bannister died in 1964, so he died before Garrison could interview him. But Bannister and Jack Martin got into a fist fight over the assassination. Jack Martin threatened to tell the feds all the weird stuff that was going on in his office. And so Bannister pistol whipped him. Right. So he wound up in the hospital over it. So he gets interviewed by Garrison's people, and David Ferrie gets interviewed by Garrison's people, and David Ferrie is a trip. This is a guy with alopecia, so he has no hair on his head. So he puts fake eyebrows and fake wigs. Right? What? So he had a fake red hair wig, red hair for some reason. And the funny thing is that E. Howard Hunt, during the Watergate era, used a fake red wig as his disguise when he was breaking into people's offices. It was like really funny that he was like, it's an homage to David Ferrie. So, but anyway, so David Ferrie is considered to be involved in this thing. He commits suicide or is suicided under mysterious circumstances during the investigation into the Kennedy assassination. Jack Martin is the only one that survives. Okay, years later, I'm interviewing a bishop in Florida who was a friend of Jack Martin.
Mhm.
And so I wanted to talk to him about Jack Martin. And he gives me photographs of Jack Martin dressed as a priest, right? And he says, Jack Martin was the guy you went to when you wanted to find out anything about anybody. He said, Martin traveled all over the country. This guy was everywhere.
Mm.
This guy, his resume was he was unemployed, he was an alcoholic, he was possibly mentally unstable, he was in hospital various times for this, and yet he's the go-to guy to get background information on anybody, right? Martin was incredible that way, and he stayed in his persona as a priest and bishop the rest of his life. So the photographs I have of him in the 1970s, years after the Kennedy assassination stuff that was going on in New Orleans, and he's in the whole outfit, right?
So wow. So you're saying that the Orthodox Catholic Church in the U.S. at the time was acting as some sort of front, possibly coordinating or helping with the JFK
No,
assassination?
the American Orthodox Catholic Church legally came into being in 1965, so it's 2 years after the assassination, legally in New York. However, it had pre-existed in different places around the country, and it got coalesced into one group in 65. And this is where it gets even stranger, because in 1965, when all this is done, the leader of that church in the Bronx,
Mm.
in New York of all places,
Mm.
is a Ukrainian priest. He forms his own church as the American Orthodox Catholic Church in the Bronx. And then he starts demanding the other churches submit to a background check by the FBI to make sure that they're acceptable to him in the Bronx, in New York.
So
And a lot of people just said, no, screw this, we're not going to do it.
yeah.
Carl Stanley,
Huh.
the guy who blurted out this thing that, David Ferry was, involved in the assassination, this weird bishop in Connecticut, he agrees, right? He goes from Connecticut to the Bronx to be anointed by this bishop, this Ukrainian bishop. He goes back to Kentucky and he's dead within a month.
Jesus.
So I did more digging from a very personal reason because I knew this church intimately. I was involved with that church in 1968 to 69.
How are you involved?
Yeah, well, that's a story.
I want to hear
And
it.
you know what they say, the first rule of Fight Club. Well, this is the story that opens up everything for me, that makes me suddenly find out that reality is not what we think it is.
Okay.
To get back to, again, your original question. This is
Yeah.
how long we go on one original question. And to get back to that question, reality isn't. Reality is really, really strange.
Yeah.
And in 1968, I was still in high school.
Mhm.
I was a senior in high school in the Bronx. And I had no intention of going to Vietnam. So a friend of mine and I, both with Eastern European backgrounds, decided, one way to get out of this, and I have to admit, I came up with this idea, is that of all the deferments there are, and there weren't many, in 1968, Vietnam was at its height. The Tet Offensive was January 68, right? So this is a very dangerous time. If you're a high school senior, you've got like two options, right? Well, three. One is get out of the country, go to Sweden or Canada or something. One is to go into the university and stay in university as long as you possibly can, maintaining a high enough average that you can stay out of Vietnam. But even then, that's like 4 years. Then after that, what are you going to do? And the other option is just go in the army, right? Say, screw it, I'm in the army. So those are the three options, but there was a fourth. And the fourth was the U.S. government would not force you to join the military if you were a priest in a church of some kind, if you were a minister. That was the 4D deferment, I believe. And I said to my friend, my friend had a closet full of weird religious paraphernalia because he belonged to something called the Third Order Franciscans, which is a kind of lay order. It's religious, but not, you're not really actually part of a monastic order. It's somewhere in between. But he loved all that stuff. So he had, chalices, he had ciboria, he had all the fancy implements and stuff. His parents were divorced. So he played one parent off the other. So he would get money from one, money from the other. He would buy all this stuff, right? So he had chasubles. He had cassocks. He had all the stuff that you really needed as a Catholic priest. He could have opened a Catholic church with all the stuff he had without exaggeration. So I said, you have all this stuff. all we have to do is incorporate as a church and we're home free. That's all we have to do. Then we're priests and screw it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we said, what? That sounds doable, right? The problem was we were under 18 at the time. We couldn't sign legal documents and we couldn't sign a corporation document. I think in New York, you had to be 21. So we had to find people to sign for us, but we eventually did. And we incorporated the Autocephalous Slavonic Orthodox Church of North and South America, Incorporated, which was just him and me.
Mm-hmm.
And one guy that we knew, an older guy that we claimed was our archbishop, right? So we became like priests in this church, and that was going to be our function. So we decided, in order to make this even realer, if that's a word, we would get dressed in all this weird stuff, Orthodox stuff. See, Catholic stuff, the Catholics had a stranglehold on being Catholic. But in the Orthodox world, there's just hundreds of Orthodox churches because they're national churches. So you have Greek Orthodox churches, Russian Orthodox, Serbian, et cetera, et cetera. There was no Czechoslovak Orthodox church. So, and that was our background. So I said, this is cool. We'll make a Czechoslovak Orthodox. It just fell into place.
Yeah.
So we do all this. It falls into place. We're done. We got it. We have the weird hats with the veils. We have crosses and stuff, and and we look genuine, right? I mean, for two 17-year-olds, we did, which is like a Halloween costume, right? But we kind of pulled it off.
Yeah.
And then we decided we were going to gate crash the funeral for Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy had just been assassinated. It was June 68. It was a big blow to me. I thought Bobby was going to be our way of getting out of Vietnam, the end of some of the racial stuff that was going on. So this was like a major blow, another Kennedy assassinated, right? My friend had different ideas. To him, this was an opportunity. He says, they're going to have the funeral in New York City at St. Patrick's Cathedral. We know the people at St. Patrick's. Why don't we just go down there during the funeral and just gate crash it, And I said, they're going to have the tightest security New York has ever known, if not the country. Another Kennedy assassinated, and the president's going to be there, and the senators and the congressmen and the cabinet and God knows who else, they're all going to be in this room? No, I don't think so. He says, no, let's just try it. So we got on the subway the night before, and we go down, and we talk to some guy in there, and we're in our full regalia, and he says, okay, I don't know, you're not on the list, but come by, and then if we can get you in, we'll get you in, something like that. So we say, okay, cool. We're two 17-year-olds. Does this make any freaking sense at all?
No, it doesn't.
At all.
Yeah.
Right? No. So they say, okay. So we say, fine, we're doing it, right? So we go into the church proper. The casket is already there. Bobby is in St. Patrick's Saturday night. So we go up to it and, do appropriately religious things. And in the pew, the only people in the church at the time is Rose Kennedy and Jackie Onassis. So they're there praying. And we're looking at them and, and they're looking at us like, who the hell are these people, right?
Whoa.
So we do this, thing and we just quietly leave. So the next day, Sunday, my friend says, we're going to do this, right? I said, we can give it a shot. We rent a limo. And we rent this limo and we take it from the Bronx to St. Patrick's. It's really weird what you can get away with in a limo, right? The limo pulls up to the side entrance of the church where all the celebrities are getting out. And we're in the limo, so we must belong, right? The driver opens up the door, we get out in all this stuff that we're wearing, and the Secret Service runs right up to us. And we had made a decision, my friend and I, that he would not speak because he's like a foreign-speaking person, and I would do all the talking because I'm a fast talker, as you can possibly realize now. But I had to do it in a foreign accent, right? Because we had to be foreign dignitaries. So the Secret Service agent walks up to us and he says, Russian Orthodox representatives? And I say, no, Slavonic Orthodox representatives. And he says, oh, okay, follow me. And he leads us into the church, leads us into the sanctuary where all the other religious dignitaries are sitting on the other side of the communion rail. If you're Catholics, any of you listening, you don't go on the other side of the communion rail unless you're a priest or an altar boy or something. You have some particular religious sacerdotal reason to be there. But we're stuck right in the front, right? My friend on one side and me on the other. We're just staring at each other. We're in there, and all these bishops and clergy and other Orthodox bishops are there. So it's freaking us out, right? But we're brassing it out. We think, well, we're here. No one's going to believe this story. And if I had been anybody else, if I had been a different person, I could have walked in there with a device. You know what I mean? I would have taken out the American leadership was in that room, not just the religious leadership. It's an incredible failure of security that this was allowed to happen. I mean, it's incredibly wrong. And yet we just brassed it out like we belonged there. So we did do that. You know, we were there for the whole service. And then because we're the last ones in, we were the first ones out. So we were supposed to lead the procession out of the cathedral. Lead it. No one knew who the hell we were. The TV cameras are pointed at us. The Klieg lights are all over us. No one knows how to identify us.
So there's probably video of you leading a funeral procession for Bobby Kennedy.
I've been looking at this for a long time. There's a very bad, very blurry video.
That's wild.
You would think there would be some perfect video of that, but there isn't.
That's a Forrest Gump moment, if I've ever...
Absolutely.
A Zelig moment.
Zelig.
Wild.
Yeah. But there is, and I just got, just a couple of days ago, a still that somebody got of the procession, and the two of us are there. So I know now, you know, this tangible evidence that exists. It's blurry, but it's us. I mean, you could look and you can see these guys don't belong where they are. So we led the procession out. It's another story. But how great was that? Because I had Andy Williams behind me singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. I had Leonard Bernstein conducting the Hallelujah chorus from Handel's Messiah, right, as the doors open on Rockefeller Center and Atlas holding up the world. And this is in June 68. I'm supposed to graduate high school that month, right? And it's like, who needs graduation, man? This is cool. This is it, you know. But we also know we're in deep shit. If somebody stops us, you know, it's all over. So we know how to get out of the church. There's an underground kind of a passageway. It's not really that secret, but unless you know, you won't know it. So we decided to go out that way. And as we're going out that way, of course, we run into Rose Kennedy and Jackie again, who are also trying to go out that same way. So we get out, but we take the subway back. We didn't keep the limo, too expensive. And then we got back to the Bronx and went back to school the next day, you know, with teachers and students looking at us and, you know, saying, nah, can't be, right? So we managed this. But the thing is, the reason I'm telling you this story is because on our way out, we bump into guys from the American Orthodox Catholic Church.
The intelligence front.
The intelligence front. They're outside. They couldn't get in. We did.
That's wild.
They couldn't.
Yeah.
They're handing us this sort of brochure. They're saying, come and see us, right? And so we're looking at each other and we said, why not? We never heard of this place. It's near the Bronx Zoo, if that means anything. So let's go and take a look. And we took a look and we wound up joining, right? Because we were two 17-year-olds, you know. My friend turned 18 that month. So we needed to know that we're going to get out of the selective service thing, out of the draft. And so one thing led to another, and we did. But there was a quid pro quo for this. So I turned 18 at a different time than my friend did. So he got his clearance before I did. So I was brought to the Selective Service Board, the headquarters in New York City, to talk to the head of Selective Service. He was a really strange guy. I'll never forget him. He wore these, you know, elbow patches, tweed jacket kind of guy, looking like an intelligence guy, looking like Alan Dulles kind of, you know. And he said, okay, no problem, you know. We're going to give you the thing. Unless you want to be a chaplain in Vietnam, we can arrange that. Making a little joke. You know,
Yeah.
Very funny.
Yeah.
He says, this is the thing, though. He says, the Russians have been moving agents into the United States through the Orthodox churches. Keep an eye out. You let us know when you see one coming through, because you know who's real and who isn't, right? You keep an eye out and just let us know. That's all. And you're cool.
So they were trying to basically operationalize you somewhat, like...
Well, the church itself, as I found out later, I found out years and years later. I mean, I always suspected, because I saw weird shit going on in that church from the beginning. But I found out years later, going through Jim Garrison's files, they had finally released his correspondence. And when I got to his correspondence and I finally saw it, I found church stationery that I had typed on back in the day.
Wild. Where
the leader of the church, a guy called Profeta, was writing letters to Jim Garrison saying, when you're finished with Jack Martin, can you send him back to us? Right? So it's there. It's in print. It's in the files.
Well, also a wild synchronicity that you end up researching the JFK assassination And you had been a part of this American Orthodox Catholic Church that was this intelligence front, which had something to do with the JFK assassination.
Yeah.
That is a time loop if I've ever seen one.
It doesn't make any freaking sense.
It doesn't make any sense.
I was 17. How the hell did we wind up in that position?
What's up, guys? One of today's sponsors is us, American Alchemy. We just launched what I think is maybe the coolest merch line in the world. When you're wearing it, it's not like you're shilling me or the channel. They're just really epic, and I think they look good. We have a couple of amazing designs for you. We have our cowboy UFO tee. Pretty epic. You see there's a rancher. He's witnessing a UFO. A little cow is getting abducted by the UFO in the background. And then you know that I love mid-century history, specifically spooky science, atomic era stuff. And so we have our atomic age tea here. Pretty cool vibe. You got a robot serving this guy a little martini and then a UFO off to the side. Go to AmericanAlchemyMerch.com. American Alchemy, MERCH.com to check out all of this amazing new apparel. The cowboy tee that I'm wearing is 100% cotton, super relaxed fit. We went for quality on these, so check them out. So they say when you're, getting briefed, like, hey, just look out for Russian spies. Yeah. How much more involvement do you have with the church itself, and do you see them do anything else that's kind of suspicious or interesting on the intelligence front?
When we were researching for our cover story as Orthodox priests, we had a lot of friends in two different Orthodox churches. One was the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia. This is important because it shows up again in New Orleans, because all those Russians around Lee Oswald and Marina, all the people he was being introduced to, were members of the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia. These were the Russian Orthodox who were anti-communist. They fled Moscow during the revolution, the Russian Revolution in 1917. They fled to Paris first, and then they opened up this operation in New York. So these are Romanovs, right? And they brought all their treasure with them, and they brought a lot of priests and bishops and stuff, and they established this church on the Upper East Side in Manhattan on Park Avenue and 93rd Street. And we would go in there all the time, right? This was like Dr. Zhivago territory. It was pure Russia. I mean, you were in Russia when you're in those premises, right? So there was a high school there. We befriended the principal of the high school. So we would know a lot of background stuff of what was going on, until the other Russians found out that he was talking to us, in which case they pushed him down an elevator shaft and broke his legs. We visited him in the hospital, and he says, "Don't come back again." That was Brother Victor, another whole story. The other church was the one on 97th Street and 5th, and that was the Russian church that owed allegiance to Moscow. That's the one they were running agents through. Okay. We would go there once in a while just to hang out and watch them, because they had a whole different way of doing the liturgy. It was kind of a different setup. And we would just sit there and watch them. And we would know when a young priest showed up from the old country. And there's one particular thing you're taught during ordination. That's a kind of a secret prayer that is responsible for changing the bread and wine into the body and blood, right? Which is the whole transubstantiation thing that we learned about in Catholic school. Well, in the Orthodox Church, it's almost the same, kind of similar. But there's a prayer and a gesture that you do to make this change official, to call down the forces to make this happen. They don't know it because they didn't go through the actual real training. They went through training to be spies, and they got enough training to pass as Orthodox priests, but they didn't get everything quite often. Sometimes the people in Moscow cleverly kept that back a little bit, and that was a signal to the guys back in the States or abroad, wherever, that the person they were sending over was not to be trusted, right? He was KGB. So you had priests who were KGB. Now, if you ever watched, there was an American television series called The Americans. It was about a husband and wife, deep sleeper agents in the United States during that time. The very last season, for those of you who can go back and take a look, featured finally, because I watched that thing from beginning to end waiting for this. The final season showed the priests who were operating as who were KGB agents operating as priests.
Wow.
And they were running, operations in New York. And so they finally talked about it. But for us, that was a big deal. And that basically kept me out of Vietnam also. Right. So this was like an important aspect of all of this, was the fact that all of this was going on. Now, this is all happening in 1968, right? I'm still 8. By that time, I'm 18 years old. So now, I'm in the middle of all of this stuff, but I don't know it's related to the Kennedy assassination at all. I have no clue, but I know there's intelligence operations going on. I know this guy is running ops because the only people who ever showed up were FBI, CIA types, right? And he bragged about it, the bishop who ran the church, Profeta. He was very, proud of the fact. And he constantly said that his people were vetted by J. Edgar Hoover himself. That's how the vetting was going on. That's why he called people back to have them vetted. Hoover himself would approve or disapprove his selection of priests and bishops. So this was obviously for what reason, right? It had to be for an intelligence operation. So we had strange guys coming in from all over the world to become bishops. People didn't even know how to genuflect or make the sign of the cross, right? And we're making these guys bishops, giving them papers and sending them back, photographing the ritual so it looks legit. So this was happening all the time. So we had guys from Italy at one point. So the Italian consulate sent people to observe this one guy becoming a bishop, and we're sending him back. But the weirdest one was during the Biafra crisis in Nigeria. Also in the 60s, there was a civil war going on in Nigeria. So you had the Biafrans, who were like the Christian element, fighting against a Muslim group in Nigeria. So they were looking for independence from Nigeria. So the Nigerians sent us this guy. I'll never forget him because I had to go to the airport to pick him up. His name was the Holy Prophet Aluya. That was his name. HP Aluya. Holy Prophet, HP. I picked him up at the airport in all kinds of African garb, right? So, as he would be as an African. So I pick him up at the airport. We take the limo, I guess, back to the Bronx. And he's going on about, how happy he is and all the rest of it to be, a member of this organization. And we consecrate him a bishop. He's now Bishop Holy Prophet Aluya. And the Nigerian embassy is there. No, the Nigerian consulate, rather, in New York is there. It's the Nigerian side, not the Biafran side, not the Christian side. It's the other side, the nationalist side, the federal side, that want him as a bishop, as a Christian bishop, to convince other Nigerians in the Christian side to stay with Nigeria as against Biafra. This was a ploy in the Civil War. The Civil War was raging when we did this. And we put him back on the plane the next day. He goes back to Nigeria. God knows what happened to him after that. We don't know. Never heard from him again.
This is fascinating, and it's just touching off a whole life for you of catching the attention of intelligence agencies
by accident.
Through pure serendipity. And I want to make that clear to any conspiratorial audience members, because I think that is emblematic, actually, of your life. Is it seems like you kind of you seek kind of sacred truth, and I think at times that sacred truth is incidental to knowledge that might be held by, government organizations, and then they get very interested in you.
Right.
You started this story off by saying first rule of Fight Club.
Yeah.
And then you also said that this story was sort of indicative for you of just how trippy reality is, how there's something else going on. Why is that for you? And how do you think the Fight Club analogy relates to this?
Yeah, good question, because I'm glad you picked up on that. I barely graduated high school. I came from a kind of a broken home situation. So there's a lot of weirdness in my family. We had traveled around a lot here and there. Strange things happened to us. And for a while in 1965, 66, I was fascinated with occultism in general, at least what we knew of it at the time, which was not much. And so Ouija board stuff, seances, that kind of thing. So I was like totally into it. Right? And it was a source of paranormal phenomenon. We actually had paranormal phenomenon. We were kids. I was 15 years old. I had a brother and sister who were younger.
What would happen?
Table levitation, that kind of the table rising, table tapping phenomenon that the Victorians were so proud of, right?
Yeah.
So we had that. We had tables rising in the air, slamming down. We had knocks on the table,
Yeah.
all of that stuff. And I'm going to high school
Huh.
in the Bronx, taking science classes. And I know that I can't talk about this to anybody, right?
Yeah.
Because this is against they would tell me I was crazy or imagining it and, uh, questioning my sanity or whatever. But I know what I saw, right? So these things would happen, but only in the beginning. And this is like a key element of how this works, right? This weird stuff will happen in the beginning because that sucks you right in.
Mm.
And once that happens, you cannot deny the evidence of your senses. There's nobody playing a hoax in that room because it's just your family. They don't have,
Yeah.
believe me, the wherewithal to carry out a hoax like that. It was a little too, elaborate. And that happens. And what happened after that was members of my family became sort of entranced with this process to the point where the phenomenon never really mattered much anymore. It was the contact with spirits. It was the contact with the other side. That became an overriding thing, and that drained me completely. That was completely something that really bothered me a great deal because it was going nowhere. It was nonsense. At one point, we were told there was going to be an Aboriginal uprising in Australia outside of Perth. It was very specific.
Mm-hmm.
And we thought, oh my God, this is going to happen. People are going to die. So my mother and I.
You were told by the spirits.
In detail.
In sort of a download or auditory, did you hear it there?
Ouija board.
Ouija board, whoa.
Letter by letter. This is how draining this is, right? So we have all this information, my mother and I, and we go to the consulate, the Australian consulate in New York, to warn them of this. That's how off the charts insane it becomes, because they're looking at us like, don't think so.
Yeah.
I really don't think so. But thanks for coming in. Right?
Uh-huh.
So I knew pretty much at that moment, and if not before, really, because I was hesitant to do all this, that there was something totally wrong that was taking place here, right? That the phenomenon in the beginning is the hook, right? And the hook is real. But then you make a lot of assumptions about what's behind the curtain, right? And so you follow that, and wherever they lead, you follow. And that's a serious mistake.
Yes.
Right? But pay attention to it anyway. If you're there, pay attention to it. Make note, because this may come in handy later, if nothing else, to reassure you that you're not going crazy, that this stuff does happen, but that it means something else. It doesn't mean what you think it is. Right? That you're putting a lot into this more than you're getting. You're putting a lot of attention. You're giving it information. You're feeding it, and you're getting a feedback from what you're feeding it. Right. This is a dangerous field for some people. You can go off the deep end if you're already weak, if you're already you don't have critical thinking ability. You don't have a lot of psychological strength. Let's say, from that point of view, this can lead you astray easily.
Yes.
And it leads people astray a lot. These are fantasies, right? And the fantasies are really powerful and really dangerous. And fantasies can sometimes become ideologies. And when they become ideologies, they take on another power because they seem like they're real too, more real than the fantasy, because they involve real people, real events, real resources. So then you're involved in this thing that I became fascinated with when I started writing Sinister Forces. How do these fantasies influence our actual everyday lives, even if we don't believe in the fantastic? But we swim in a sea of fantasies, of ideologies, of people insisting certain things are true when they're not, so, and you believe and trust these people, right? For whatever reason. And this is what is really dangerous. So when I started to shift my studies away from sort of Ouija board style occultism, I wanted to know there was something darker, there's something deeper. Is there a way to exert control and not be controlled? Because being controlled to me was a disaster that I witnessed. So how can I then exert control over this phenomenon? Is it possible? And that sort of led me down this path that I've been on since that time, since 1965 roughly, until this time, was to find out how do you exert control over it. And exerting control does not always mean what you think it means, like the Sorcerer's Apprentice, Mickey Mouse with the mops and the buckets, if you remember the first opening scene of Fantasia, which, why would you? But anyway, this is a famous, it's a famous trope right? The Sorcerer's Apprentice. The Sorcerer's Apprentice is out of touch, really, thinks they understand how it works because they've watched the sorcerer, and now they're doing the same thing and they cannot control it. It goes out of control completely. So the sorcerer has to come in and fix it, right? So this is the problem that we face. The idea of control is not always what we think it is. The control sometimes starts internally. You have to build up an internal system of control first, right? And that can only happen when you have an internal system of understanding, when you really know what's going on, when you know yourself. And that doesn't mean in the sort of hippies, 60s, know yourself kind of thing. It means something a little darker, maybe a little deeper, certainly, but to really know the way you interact with the outside world, that point of tangents between yourself and the outside world. That's where the sort of matrix is. Talking about reality, to go back to your, again, original question, the idea of reality, what is it? As Robin Williams said, reality, what a concept.
Yeah.
It is a malleable concept for sure, and we all have different versions of it. You have to figure out what your version of it is and kind of go from there slowly, step by step.
I almost think control is almost a misnomer too. Like having some sort of deliberate intention feels like of utmost importance, but there are all these paradoxes, like probably in order to quote unquote control, you need to like be okay losing control at the same time having faith in something higher. I think of control, there's obviously the proverbial kind of left-hand path in occultism,
right?
Or the idea of sort of storming heaven or something, with and you write about this in your book about celestial ascent traditions, a Stairway to Heaven. And so, it's like, it feels like this like really hard art form that is,
You've touched on it exactly. It's an art form.
Yeah, it's not a science.
Not exactly. Not yet. Aleister Crowley famously said, magic is the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will. It's a pretty good introductory statement. It is an art. You begin to realize it is an art. That which motivates art, that which creates art, that feeling, that artistic expression, that's closer to what this is than science. But science has an input to it, right? The more we understand about the artistic impulse, the more we can kind of isolate the scientific parts of it, understand how they work. If we're talking about consciousness, we are now in that murky territory where art and science kind of mix. And it may be that art will have more to tell us about how consciousness works than science right now, right? Because we're kind of limited into repeatability with science. Science depends upon repeatability of an experiment. And this is what's destroyed a lot of people in the occult field, broadly speaking, especially the mediums, the clairvoyants, the people who claim to predict the future and things like that. Once they've done it a few times, like the table knocking that I experienced, you have that a few times, people want you to repeat it. And you can't under those circumstances. Quite often, it's really difficult to do, right? So you make up, you fake it. And that's the part where you lose your soul to this whole process, where you try to keep people interested, you try to keep the public on your side, you try to prove that your initial experience was real, so you fake another experience, hoping nobody will notice, right? And that's where you cross the line.
Yeah.
Exactly. You have to be willing to understand that your experience is possibly non-repeatable, not under scientific laboratory conditions. Difficult to do, right? You get like some statistical anomalies with the remote viewers and with all those guys at the SRI and all those guys who were testing all of this. You'll get statistical, improvements. You got Ingo Swann, who did tremendous work in that area, right? But it's still, when you force somebody to do something, unless they're really masters of it already, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, it feels like unless something's truly kind of heart-centered, there's always some sort of mean reversion or rebound effect. If you look at all the random event generators or remote viewing or any of these things, you end up with all these kind of, infighting dynamics of the participants. You think they're like the most conscious people, but they're kind of like the most unconscious in some ways. And the effects always fail on them in the end. There's always almost this Faustian kind of like blow-up moment at the end where like it all goes to shit. And You know, there's a biblical story of Simon of Magus who uses like black magic to levitate, and then he sees Peter and Paul, levitating much higher. And I think the word simony comes from the fact that he tried to like buy their ability, which came from God, to levitate, super, super high.
Sure.
And so there are all these, it feels like, what you're talking about, navigating this terrain is, you're walking a very straight and narrow path. There are a bunch of landmines everywhere.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so where does the Fight Club analogy come in?
Well, when you're asked to define this field, when you're asked to define, I don't like the word occultism because it sounds like Marxism or capitalism. Like it sounds like an ideology, right? And it's not. Yeah. Or maybe for some people it is. When you're asked to define it, let's use the term magic because it's kind of universal. When you're asked to define it, you can't. You fall apart. You can't define Fight Club. You can't talk about it. If you try to talk about it, the problem is the language that I'm using relies upon a set of assumptions that we all make about what those words mean. And that's a real problem. Okay, so we're talking in a language we think we both understand what we're saying, but there's a point at which I know we're not. Right? And we're trying. We can honestly try. We sincerely want to, but our language itself is in the way. The tools that we're using are difficult. They're providing roadblocks.
Yeah, or like if you think of each of us as kind of like a measurement instrument, like your aperture needs to be adequately open to sort of resonate with this. It's like the Jesus saying you need ears to hear.
Or I have to calibrate to yours.
Sure.
Right? The other way, right? So, I mean, this is the problem that we face, and that's just in English.
Yeah.
When you're talking about understanding it from, a Jewish Kabbalah, for instance, I've done a lot of study in that direction, or you're talking about other Chinese alchemy, for instance. I mean, they're using language. We translate it into English, so we think we know what they're talking about. But there's always that point at which, we don't know. There's always that point where they're saying something, they mean something else than what is really being translated, right?
Yeah.
So this is a problem. That's why they use pictures. That's why alchemy uses pictures, and Chinese alchemy uses pictures, and occultism is replete with images and pictures, which is how, to go back to all the way back to the beginning of this conversation, which is how the abductees and contactees feel that they're communicating with alien intelligences, not through words, but through images.
Yeah, it feels like a mimetic layer that is sort of sublinguistic or something. One of my favorite Terence McKenna quotes is, "A secret is not something that isn't told, it's something that cannot be told."
Right.
So to your point, it's like sort of inherently locked in.
Right.
And, if you were a true secret society, not one of these sort of things that like, I don't know, they wear the sort of fake garb or whatever, then it would be sort of inherently impenetrable, and it would like sort of act on some like truly hermetically sealed layer that like even certain participants in it wouldn't even know they were a part of it.
Right.
So yeah, it's so fascinating. Where do we go from here? Well, what does all of this have to do with UFOs? Because you and Tom DeLonge, who I think is extremely knowledgeable on this topic, and both of you guys in your own ways caught the attention of some extremely impressive people in the government, people like Neil McCaslin and Rob Weiss, who I guess isn't government, he was Skunk Works Lockheed, but adjacent.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that process of how, similar to your experience in the Orthodox Catholic Church, how you kind of bumped into the highest levels of government and their interest in the topics of non-human intelligence?
Tom contacted me, I think much the way just out of the clear blue sky. And it was the end of 2014, November, I think, when he first contacted me, and I didn't believe it was Tom DeLonge, because I get a lot of weird emails, as you might expect, and some very strange, some strange phone calls also. And so I, okay. But then I did a little background and got back to him, I think the same day later or something. And he said, okay, let's talk. And we spoke on the phone first. We had a lot of very long conversations from 2014 to the beginning of 2015. Went on for hours.
Hmm.
But basically his pitch was, I want to knock on doors. I want to go to their offices. I want to find out what's going on with the UFO phenomenon. Once and for all, I think this is the time we're going to go and we're just going to do what we can to do it. Whatever resources I have, due to my celebrity, due to whatever other resources I might have, contacts in government and in the military and all the rest of it, we're going to exploit these as much as we can to get to the bottom of this.
And why is he reaching out to you to say this?
You know, he'd never actually told me point blank why. He never came out and said this was the moment why. My assumption is because of a presentation I did in Amsterdam around 2000, I don't remember, 2007, 8, 9, something like that, early 2000s. On the Secret Space Program was the name of this thing. I was invited to come there and talk on the Secret Space Program. I had no clue what he meant. This guy, right? In Amsterdam, this Dutch guy contacted me and says, "We want you to, whatever you want to talk about, but this is the name, this is the theme, the overall theme." And so I said, "Okay, I'll talk about we've just talked about the UFO situation, the connection to the Kennedy assassination. We'll do that, right?" So I did that, and it was at that symposium that I met like everybody. I met Richard Dolan was there. Timothy Good was there. In fact, we split a bottle of scotch.
Wow.
We had nothing else to do. After the whole thing was over, we were in a part of Amsterdam. It was kind of remote from any place else, so we just sat there and drank. I met a lot of people from the industry, I guess you'd call it, the community, who were there giving various speeches about various things. But I made this one speech about this. And yeah, it was weird because I was slides and I had pictures of everybody and, I showed them who they were, like in the movie JFK, here's Jack Martin, here he is in real life wearing the real stuff. And here's, back and forth, and went through the whole thing and talked about secrecy, government secrecy, where the UFO project was concerned. And I said, this is the problem. There's a lot of weird stuff here. You're not being told the weird stuff. I only happen to know it from an accident. I happen to have been there and seen some of the weird stuff. I said, the weird stuff is there, but it's all considered classified. However, I said, our information is not considered classified. My personal information is not classified. I said, we need to spin that around where we can tell the government, our information is classified. You can't have it, right? For some reason, I was just riffing because they told me to keep it going because my speech had been too short, right? The other guy wasn't coming on yet for like 15 minutes. They said, "Can you throw it out?" So I said, "Okay, I'll talk. I'll keep on going. What can I riff on what I just said?" And I spin it out to that statement. And suddenly he gets a standing ovation, right? I'm thinking, holy crap. What kind of a crew am I here with? I'm surrounded by all these people who thought this was the point. I'm talking about the Kennedy assassination. Hoover and, E. Howard Hunt and all these guys and Fred Krisman and Guy Bannister. And the part they liked was the classified part, right? So anyway, that got carried on a lot of YouTube channels. Suddenly that was all over the place, right? That one particular presentation got a lot of views, hundreds of thousands of views when it first came out. So I think that might have been the trigger because nobody ever associated me with the UFO phenomenon before. I had written about it in Secret Machines.
Yeah.
Sinister Forces.
Yep.
Too many books, getting confused. But in Sinister Forces, there's just one chapter there's one chapter on the assassination with all these weird guys.
Yeah.
And then in a later volume called Communion, there's a chapter on the UFO phenomenon per se and conversations I had with Whitley Strieber, who had contacted me years earlier for something kind of unrelated. But, we began this long conversation on email on this subject also.
What do you think they meant when they said, "Hey, come speak about the secret space program"? Because that term carries a lot of baggage and is often associated with the network Gaia and Corey Goode and, this idea of 20 and back or whatever. And this sort of, all that sort of stuff,
that
which
was connected with
seems like, honestly, BS to me. And yet you write about celestial ascent and, the idea that, you can ascend through 7 levels and that there's sort of this map and that, maps to, the Big Dipper
Sure.
and the North Star.
Yeah.
And so does that somehow have to do with some sort of secret space program? That concept? The like
That would be
Kabbalistic
so cool, wouldn't it?
concept? It would be interesting.
It would be
Yeah.
really cool. I don't think so. No, what you're talking about, the 20 and back and all this other stuff, that's supposed to be literal.
Mm,
That's supposed to be you get into a spaceship and you go. And we
mm.
have technology to do that. And I've heard, I mean, I was on a panel with guys, I mean, who insisted that we have trade agreements with other planets and stuff, and we're trading back and forth.
Do you
and
believe any of that? Or?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
Not any of it.
Yeah, I don't really either.
I'm not part of the Corey Good crowd or the
Yeah.
Stephen Wilcock, if I can
No,
drop other names. And
same.
I just,
But then sometimes I think about those guys and I'm like, if you wanted to stigmatize a thing, you'd put out a thing that's adjacent to the truth
Right.
and ridiculous sounding, and nobody would ever look at that thing again.
right.
And so,
Right.
I don't know. Is there anything there?
From my way of thinking, everything I've heard them say and everything they've put forward, I have to say, I've been to a lot of contact in the desert stuff
Yeah.
over the years, right?
Yeah.
I was initially invited long ago to replace somebody, I think, and then I was invited to replace Jim Mars, who was sick that year and who passed away that year. He was a good friend.
Hmm.
So I was at a lot of contact in the desert things, and I've heard a lot of weird stuff. I've been on a lot of panels with people who insisted on things that were just simply not true, especially when it came to comparing all this stuff and mixing it in together with occult ideas, right?
Mm.
When they started doing that, then they really lost me because they were obviously talking about things they did not know or understand,
Yeah.
stuff that they had read on a website somewhere or something. And so they drew all of these correspondences together and were promoting these weird combinations of things, right? And I kept strenuously trying to point that out, even publicly on the dais with everybody else saying, no, that's not how this works, right? That is not how it works. What do you mean? Of course it is. No, it's not how it works, right? Did you listen to me the last half hour? No, it doesn't work. So there's been that pushback. They want to believe in this. It gives them a format. It gives them freedom to make shit up.
Yeah.
Is what it is. And when you throw a cult in there, you can make shit up.
Well, it almost feels like, based on your discussing the interconnection between the JFK assassination and the UFO phenomenon, that there are sort of reality managers, like maybe even like above humanity, that can like choreograph or pull the strings on things. And that does have to do with the occult. Like I think of, the Borderland Society, this sort of occult research group, like in the 40s, they were aware of certain UFO crashes before the government was. And there's documentation of that.
Yep.
You have stuff with James Jesus Angleton and Hugh Angleton being involved in the Knights of Malta and certain secret societies. And then obviously a lot of the early CIA was sort of skull and bones. And so you wonder, is there some hermetic substructure? Like we think of, the government, disclosure, like the president knows everything. But like, is there some sort of choreography going on behind the scenes that most humans aren't aware of? Maybe a few are?
Well, the whole point of sinister forces was that there are sinister forces.
Yeah.
Right. But these sinister forces are such that to equate them with, how shall I put it, 20 and back?
Yeah.
No, come on.
No, yeah.
So, I mean, this is the thing. Is there an occult concept here? Obviously, I think I've shown through documentation the connection with the UFO phenomenon and the Kennedy assassination as an example. These are documented individuals that had documented histories, right? So that we know. And the churches, that's again documented, right? So all of this is there. But does that mean there's a cabal of high-ranking Freemasons or something pulling the strings? No, because that's too public again, right?
Yeah.
That's not how this works. So there is again, we're talking about Fight Club.
Yeah.
There is a mechanism whereby these things happen, right? Whereby a Belgian mystic, at the turn of the century in Europe could predict Kennedy's assassination.
Tell me about that.
Well, there was a mystic who wrote the famous play, The Bluebird. Okay, they made movies out of it. Maurits Maeterlinck, Belgian mystic. And he was a mystic. He was an astrologer. He was a mystic. He also won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And he wrote The Bluebird, which they made into various versions. And if we get into Bluebird, that's pulling on a whole bunch of threads that we really don't have time
Well,
for.
Operation Bluebird was pre-MK Ultra.
Yes, it was. It was the first MK Ultra.
Was it named after Metterlink?
This is the point I'm coming to make.
Okay.
Because the same guy who wrote that wrote a play called The Cloud That Lifted. And The Cloud That Lifted is about the assassination of a political leader where shots were fired from a grassy knoll. We don't know how many shots were fired. There's a discrepancy. And the guy who fired the shots might have worked for Russia, according to the plot of the play.
It's Lee Harvey Oswald.
And his name was Alec, which was Lee Harvey Oswald's name in Minsk. And he lived there. His
That's
nickname was Alec.
That is wild.
This was all written before Kennedy was born. So if there's somebody pulling the strings, is it a somebody the way we think of a somebody? Or is it a mechanism of some kind, as Vallée called it, a control mechanism?
Yeah.
Right?
It feels like that. It feels like things are sort of, like I think the new agey dumb word we use to describe it, your term is like quantum entangled or something, but it feels like that. Like that's one example where the probability of that sort of prediction at that level of specificity so goes beyond like any sort of prosaic explanation around survivorship bias or, like selectivity bias or whatever. And there are tons of other examples if you look for this sort of thing. There's this book written by Morgan Robertson in 1898 called Wreck of the Titan, or Futility, Wreck of the Titan.
Right.
And this ship is called the Titan, and it crashes in the middle of the Atlantic at night. And it hits an iceberg, and it's the largest, liner of its time, and it's in April, and it's the same size as the Titanic. And so you get down to like levels of specificity that are insane, and it's like basically a decade before the Titanic. I think some blue-blooded elites were on board. The Astros were on board the actual Titanic. Right. And you have a lot of these examples. There's a sci-fi author, Dean Koontz, who predicted COVID, the Wuhan lab. Yep. You have this kind of modern, self-proclaimed prophet talking about Trump getting shot in the ear, that he was shot in. Right. Like 4 months before it happened or whatever. You have the adventures of Don and Baron Trump and their time-traveling adventures, which is a book that was written, I think, also in the 19th century. So it's just crazy how many examples.
And there was the book that talked about the Texas Tower sniper before it ever happened.
Wow.
With specificity, even to the name of the police chief, who was not the police chief at the time, even to the name of the police chief, who was the police chief eventually, the one who solved the case, who got the sniper. His name is actually mentioned in the book, and he was not part of the police at that time. He was not anywhere near it, right? So the whole Texas Tower sniper thing was completely described in advance.
Was that Texas A&M or where?
Texas A&M.
That was A&M, yeah. And so is this like you're glitching into a future that already, in a block universe like pre-exists, and you're sort of like, figuring out what's happening, you're getting some download? Or is it some sort of predictive programming where you are causing the future by writing about these things?
I think we have to go back to Russ Cole. And time is a spiral. Kind of. Time is a spiral. The glitch is the proof. The glitch is the proof that this is a malleable reality that we live in. I'll give you an example. In Indonesia, I spent some time in Indonesia. Fascinating place. It's a place that, from a Western perspective, makes no sense because we think of things in a certain way. And when you go to a country like Indonesia, which is a majority Muslim country, over 250 million people, Muslims, the fourth largest country in the world. And you think of it as a Muslim, it is a Muslim primarily country, but it's replete with Hindu and Buddhist statuary, archaeological sites going back hundreds and hundreds of years, right? Which are maintained and kept. And sometimes you'll find incense burning and flowers brought and all the rest of it, right? In this impossible place. They have a series of calendars, right? They don't use just one calendar, right? So they use our calendar like for business purposes and general international purposes. Then there's the Muslim calendar, which is a lunar calendar. Okay, all Muslim countries do that. But then they have a bunch of other calendars. right? There's a 5-day week calendar, for instance, and they calculate special days, special ritual days based on these things. And the whole point is, it's a civilization very aware, very conscious of coincidence.
Mm.
Coincidence is like the thing that shows you there's a force in the universe.
Mm.
When these calendars start to coincide at specific places, that's like the coincidence that starts something off, right? So they don't measure time the same way that they're measuring it by solar and lunar and a bunch of other systems,
Mm.
right? And they interlock, kind of. And so they publish books called a primbon, which is like an almanac, right? To tell the future, to decide when you're born, things about your life, what dreams mean and all the rest of it. But then there's the calendars that are very important. So if you're conducting rituals, you have to follow not the regular calendar. You have to follow one of these ritual calendars, which are 5-day week calendars, as an example, right? So you have those that you have to follow. So then you're building up a mindset that's based on the idea of synchronicity and coincidence and different levels of reality operating at different times, right? Or operating at the same time, but different levels of reality.
So fascinating.
So you can be in one or the other.
Yes.
Right? So which enables them basically to be Muslim and, in my case of living there, Javanese, right? People from the island of Java, they have their own traditions, their own ways of doing things. They visit graves, right? Which you're not supposed to do if you're Islamic. And they have other practices that we would find really strange, and which Muslims find very strange also. But they're protected by their Islamic faith and by the imams and everybody else. And they're doing things that we would consider perhaps a little questionable, right?
Like what?
I know you were going to ask me that. So my psychic powers are working. Well, for instance, I was fascinated by this one thing that I had heard about and I could not believe, but it's true. There is a cemetery. There's a number of cemeteries in Java that do this. There's one in particular that I visited that in this cemetery, if you're a Muslim and you're a devout Muslim, this is only for devout Muslims. This is not for tourists. You go to this particular spot. There is the grave of a famous prince who had died on that spot, and his grave is there. But a lot of other graves as well. It's a cemetery, an Islamic cemetery. And you go there because you need something. Like Catholics have novenas, right? Those who are Catholic know what a novena is. It's like every Good Friday, every first Friday is 9 in a row or something. You perform a ritual. You pray for something to happen, some good thing to happen. Somebody is sick, you want them healed, or you need success in business, or whatever it happens to be. You pray a novena for it. Well, this is something similar, again using that calendar. So on a particular day every month, you go to this site and you have sex with a stranger.
Jesus.
Not necessarily Jesus, but a stranger. And
at a burial, at a grave?
Yeah. Okay. Let me back up a little bit.
Okay.
You have to be married first because Islam does not approve of extramarital relationships.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an imam there who will perform the marriage ceremony. So you marry this stranger in a regular ceremony. Then you have sex in the cemetery, either on the ground, on a grave, or they've been building little shacks, little huts for this purpose as well. And that takes place. And then in the morning, you go to the imam and you get divorced.
What?
It's legal. And then the next month you come back, the same thing happens again. And you do that for a specified number of times. Depends on the purpose. It depends on what book you're reading, I guess. But that's what's done. And it's done. I was there and I didn't witness the act, but I
witnessed.
What's
the symbolic purpose of that?
This is where Indian and Javanese things start to combine, start to come together, right? The kings of Java, of Indonesia in general, before the rise of Islam, were considered tantric kings. Borobudur is a beautiful example. Prambanan also, which is Hindu and Buddhist. They were very involved in the tantric interpretation of Indian religion. In fact, even the Dalai Lama came to bless the Borobudur monument as saying this was a representative of Vajrayana Buddhism. This was their their system, their Tibetan system. The guy who brought Buddhism to Tibet, Atisha, studied in Indonesia before he left and went to India, and then brought somehow the teachings were brought to Tibet. So there's a Tibet-India-Indonesia connection that's very strong. So we don't know all the details on this very well, but there's a story about the prince and a lost love, and the love of his life died, and then he committed suicide or something. So you go and you reenact this wedding night at his grave to get his attention, so that he bestows upon you these whatever it is that you're looking for.
Wow. That is crazy. But it's fascinating that you have whole groups of people. There's studies that like the language you have determines your outlook on life and
Yes.
your kind of perceptive epistemology itself.
Sure.
So like Germans are more pessimistic because like they speak more in past tense or something. I've
heard that, yeah.
botching that slightly, but like something like that. And so if you have a kind of a whole epistemology that is more based on meaning than time,
Right.
and connections between events versus just some like flowing of time that
Right.
is sort of permanent. You have the proverbial kind of river of time that you get out. You never get out in the same place twice.
Right.
That will probably beget a whole different epistemology in life that you would lead, and society and culture, if you extrapolate that out. So it's fascinating. Time is the most used noun in the English language, and it's completely undefinable. It's definable only with respect to the movement of bodies, or even, in science, it's sort of, oscillations on an electromagnetic wave or something.
Sure.
But it's so weird, and it's weird scientifically too. It's taken as this kind of classical axiom in quantum mechanics. But you have time uncertainty with level of energy. Just like you have position and momentum uncertainty. And then obviously you have time dilation and kind of a general relativity context. And then gravity kind of makes sense and, doesn't make sense, in the quantum context. And then gravity and time are obviously extremely interlinked and related. Like time slows the closer you get to like a black hole, for example. So time itself is just so weird. It's so weird.
It's more of an experience than anything else.
It's experience itself. And then there's probably some substrate of meaning that like your mind is sort of a time machine that's like reading something that's reality itself, that's much deeper. It's like a punch card or something, and your mind is doing the punching.
Right.
But it's like that's not the substrate, like whatever that sort of paper is, and you can maybe move the cursor along different tracks to kind of switch analogies there, but like. It's very strange.
Yeah, it is. It's Fight Club.
It's Fight Club, yeah. Yeah, it's hard to sort of talk about these things. So how specifically? So okay, so you do this speech about the secret space program or whatever,
Right.
in Amsterdam, and then how do you catch the eye of? Because Neil McCaslin is like doing foreign material exploitation at Wright-Patterson, which if you know anything about Roswell, like the material ends up in foreign material exploitation at, Wright-Patterson, at least according to the Philip J. Corso account and like a lot of UFO lore.
Yeah.
So if there was ever a guy to like really know what the quote unquote UFO program is and holds knowledge-wise, it would be this guy, and he's reaching out to you?
Well, we reached out. I mean, I don't know how Tom does what Tom does. Okay. But what did happen that I'm reasonably sure was part of this. Tom asked me to write something that he could show people about what we were up to, what we were trying to do. And that became the very first opening pages of Secret Machines, Gods. And that's the cargo cult chapter.
Yeah.
Kind of a prologue to this. So cargo cult was a couple of pages long. And the idea was, take the cargo cult concept and say that's how we started on this planet. This is how civilization began. That we, as the 21st century civilization that we are, our origins are as a cargo cult. Now, if you know what a cargo cult is, I'm assuming that you do. It's in the South Pacific Islands in the early 20th century, planes would land on islands in the South Pacific, near the Indonesian islands to the far east, and planes would land, and there were basically Stone Age level tribes living there. And a plane would land, and stuff would come out of the plane, all these goods and services, right? So you had packages of stuff, you had medicines, you had food supplies, you had weapons, because this was the beginning of the war. And these Stone Age tribes are looking at this thing, and they're saying, God damn, we don't know that you could do that, right? So they went and they built landing strips, hoping that these planes would land and give them stuff. They said, that's all you really need to do. You build a landing strip, you get like a conning tower or something, and you imitate what we're seeing, and maybe planes will land and give us all this good stuff also. That was the concept. So our concept in starting this project was that our entire society is a cargo cult, because everything we're trying to do to longevity, to live forever, and to travel to the stars has its roots in something extraterrestrial, has its roots in these stories we tell about the gods who came to visit us, right? The gods who came down and gave us agriculture, gave us writing, gave us all these things. It's always some supernatural being. It's never Joe from next door who taught us how to write,
Yeah.
It's always this creature that comes down, usually from space.
What are examples in kind of mythology?
Well, the famous one, I guess, is Oannes in the Sumerian myths, right? So here is a god who lands in the river, outside of Sumer, and comes up out of a vehicle of some kind, and he's wearing a weird suit with a strange hat, which we can talk about later. And he walks up to the people and he starts teaching them stuff. He teaches them math. He teaches them writing. He teaches them agriculture. And then every night he goes back down into his craft in the ocean. He never eats or drinks when he's on land with these people, right? Doesn't want to eat or drink. We don't even know if he's breathing because he's wearing a hat of some kind. Goes back down and then eventually flies away back into space. And he's the person who gave the Sumerians the knowledge of writing and agriculture and everything else that Sumerians are famous for supposedly having invented. So that's their story. That's their creation myth, from that point of view. There's another creation myth, which is much more like the one we have in Genesis, with good angels and bad angels, basically, good gods and bad gods and all the rest of it. But this one is the idea that they got their knowledge from this creature. And the hat that he's wearing is depicted on artwork, and it looks like a fish's head. Like the head of a fish, like maybe it was down this way and he pulled it up to talk to them and then put it back down the other way. But that fish's head, of course, is identical to the Catholic bishop's mitre. It's exactly the same design. So we don't know what that means because that design is bizarre. The Orthodox one is nicer. It's a crown, a real crown, with jewels on it and stuff, which we used to make for the other bishops when I was in the church. So that was like a thing we did as a business. But the Catholic one was kind of simple. It was just like, a folded thing that you could open up and just stick on your head that way.
So do you think, like in your actual model of reality, do you think that, at the advent of kind of the agricultural revolution where you get writing, urbanization, history all begins, mythology begins, that there was an initial contact event with people from the stars?
Right. That's our thesis.
Yeah.
It's our point, as we call it. This is when everything really began. Because it appears as though we lived on the planet for a long time not really caring about any of that stuff, right? We were happy.
Yeah.
And then suddenly there's these beings that come down and say, no, you've got to write, and you've got to keep track, and you've got to have numbers. And, and besides, look at the stars. Did you ever look up? Did you ever wonder like what all that's about? So, and suddenly we're all like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
And so we're doing that. Can you imagine the Babylonians, the impetus behind the Sumerians and the Babylonians, the Akkadians, to stare at the night sky and chart those stars?
It's amazing. And all the Graham Hancock, Robert Schoch stuff, like the most interesting part about all of it is how astronomically aligned all of this ancient megalithic architecture is to the stars. Not only to the stars, but to like the alignment of the stars in like 10,500 BC.
Right.
It's fascinating.
It's fascinating because not only they didn't have telescopes, obviously, but the fact that they would, because you don't have a telescope, You have to sit there and watch it for hours. You've got to mark the passage of these things. The planets is one thing, right? The sun and moon is like the obvious ones, right? They're easy to see. But then once you get past that, you're talking about the other planets. You have to notice that there is certain planets that don't stay in the same place as the other ones do. That's the beginning. So you're starting to keep track of that. And then you're keeping track of the background stars that don't move, right? Or they move like in a circular motion. The amount of work that requires, the amount of attention to detail. And you have to be writing at that point. There's no other way to keep track, right? You can't memorize it. So you're writing all of this down. So that's integrated with the idea of writing, language, and numbers. It's all integrated with the math of astronomy. You need both of those things to understand what's happening, right? To keep track, to keep a record. That to me is amazing. Why do that?
And it's a quantum leap from being a hunter-gatherer.
Absolutely.
It's a just a huge jump.
Yeah.
So obviously outside of generically a lot of myths involving people from the stars coming down and, teaching knowledge of the stars and, mapping the cosmos, is there a myth that most comports with your version of what actually happened?
Oh, I think no. I think part of the short answer is no, there isn't one. But one of the points we make in Secret Machines, we try to make it a couple of times, I hope I don't bore anybody with it, is the fact that everybody has a piece of the story. Everybody's got a piece of what happened, and we ignore the other pieces at our peril. Everybody has a creation story similar to this. When I say everybody, in general terms. So in Asia, in South America, in Australia, all over Europe, everybody has a kind of story about this. They have a way of they're trying to explain what happened. We need to pay attention because there's data hidden in those stories. There's definitely data there. We have to look for that data. We have to listen to these stories. We have to save them from extinction. Everybody on the planet has a piece of the story. We're all blind men with the elephant, which is the thing I always talk about. We always have a piece of that elephant. No one has the whole picture. No one in this country does, right? No one in Russia or China or anywhere else does. We all have pieces of it. We need to collaborate on that if we're really going to get to the root of this situation.
Sounds like the Tower of Babel or something.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. We're split this way, and we keep reinforcing that split, and it's terrible because we're blinded by, as I mentioned in the very beginning, the ideologies and the fantasies, right? They get in the way of the data, right? We need to kind of strip a lot of that out and get back to what did your ancestors tell you,
Perhaps what's most remarkable about this story, though, is you have a guy who's working at Wright-Patterson,
Yeah.
and then you have another guy who's like, running like Skunkworks, which is the most advanced R&D division of,
Right.
Lockheed, responsible for the SR-71 and U-2 spy planes.
Yeah.
And they get interested in your work because you're talking about a cargo cult that humanity and religion itself being an outgrowth of an early contact event.
Yeah.
And it's almost as if they have some sort of ontological model of reality that comes from like a lot of data around this stuff.
That's our impression. We got into a point in 2015, I guess it was, that Tom is sending me these long emails that he's getting, right? And he's saying, "What the hell do you make of this?" Right? And we get on the phone and we start talking about this, and I'm saying, we're having an all the president's men moment right here. I said, we're having a deep throat moment because people are trying to tell us something without telling us something.
Right.
It's like follow the money, right?
Yeah.
They're giving us hints of where we should go on this. And we have to pay attention to what they're not telling us and what they're telling us. And this came across because at one point, somebody sent us this long email, one of his most trusted advisors said, have you really looked, how much do you know about Greek mythology? It's like, whoa.
Who said that?
I can't say.
Okay.
So he came out and said that. It was a he. He came out and said, do that, right? And it's specifically talking about Prometheus. Now that gives the show away, right? If we take the Prometheus story as an encrypted story of what actually happened, we're getting close. And I think that is what it is. There, at some point, somebody did something they weren't supposed to do.
Mm.
And it might have jump-started civilization on this planet, right?
Mm.
It might have been that. But Prometheus suddenly became the thing. And so Tom is saying, what the fuck do we know about Prometheus? And so I'm saying, let's take it easy. Let's go. Prometheus was this guy who stole fire from the gods, right?
Mm-hmm.
For the humans, he was giving fire to the humans. Humans didn't have fire. They were freezing their asses off. Prometheus came down and said, here's fire, get warm, And the gods didn't like that. So they punished Prometheus. You're going to get chained to a rock, You're going to be punished for the rest of your existence for this thing. So I said, let's go back and look at this. This is what they're trying to tell. They're trying to tell us something. And what is Prometheus about? It's about contact between the humans and the gods. And the one who made the contact was a god, not one of the humans.
That's right. And it was a god who was transgressing on behalf of humans against the gods themselves, sort of a rebel,
right?
Sleeper cell god.
Yeah. Which the Gnostics believed was the serpent in the Garden of Eden. That the serpent was God, that the God that we know of from the Bible was the imposter, the interloper, the guy who was not really God.
So I got breakfast with Tom DeLonge once, who I love, by the way. I think he's
a great guy.
He's the best.
Yeah.
And he actually referenced Gnostic thought at the time. He was talking about the archons, who were considered kind of almost imprisoners of the kind of lower material world and like Gnostic ideology. And you hear Gnostic thought, run across a lot of ufology. Like it seems like Jacques Vallée is roughly kind of Gnostic in his orientation. So do you think that we're living in some sort of lower prison planet and, our senses are all there to sort of mislead us and we need to somehow escape in some sort of disembodied way? Or what's your sort of, take on that?
You're talking about Fight Club again. Some of us are in prison, right? Some of us have seen The Exit. There was a famous author, Wilhelm Reich, the inventor of the orgone box and orgone therapy and all of that. But he was very well known. He was anti-communist and anti-fascist both at a time when that position was untenable in this country anyway. So he was against authoritarianism in general. And he wrote a book about that. And he has this image that I've never forgotten, that we're all in this prison, we're all in this box, but there's an exit sign. There's a big sign with the shining letters, exit. But the guy who points to that exit and says, there's the exit, gets immediately beaten by everybody else in the prison. And that image has stayed with me for a very long time. There's an exit sign, right? There's a way out. We know what the way out is. We're just, we're afraid of it. We're too distracted by everything else. But the idea of becoming free in oneself is there. It's just a question of wanting to do it badly enough that you're going to beat down the people who are trying to stop you from getting there to get to that exit. Right. So the whole celestial ascent thing was an example of that, of people understanding that there was a way out, but that it involved kind of reprogramming, to use that awful term, but a reprogramming oneself, to get rid of a lot of the extraneous stuff that we're reacting to. We're constantly reacting to things, kind of knee-jerk reactions to things that this is good and this is bad. It's a binary choice, right? And it's not a binary choice. There's a tertiary choice. There's a choice beyond A and B. There's a choice beyond plus and minus, right? I guess the Crowley people say 0 equals 2. That's one way of formulating this idea. But there's a way of getting out of it. But it's not. It's almost impossible to describe, and people have to get to it themselves, right? They have to get to it on their own path. They have to want to do it, right? And they have to be willing to follow a path while maintaining a sense of humor. Once you lose that sense of humor, you're screwed. Because then you become a fanatic. Fanatics famously have no sense of humor. And what you need is that sense of humor, which is a sense of what I'm looking at may be real and it may not be. Isn't it funny? What if it is real? What if it isn't equally, right? It's a way of negotiating territory that's very dangerous.
Yeah, that's right. I think like a lot of people get really into synchronicities, and when you put a ton of weight on the synchronicities, you're sort of in really bad territory.
Oh, yeah.
And when you put no weight in synchronicities, you're also in bad territory. So it's like a Scylla and Charybdis between extreme
Yep.
randomness, materialist reductionism, and then on the other side, you're just drenched in meaning. Everything's meaningful in this sort of, self-defeating way. So you think, wow, so there's a way out, but it's impossible to talk about. But you do talk about it because you wrote a book about it. Stairway to Heaven.
All my books are about it.
Yeah. Okay. Fascinating.
They're all chapters of one book.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, that's amazing that you're saying that. Well, what do you mean when you say that exactly? You think secret machines,
Sure.
and sinister forces? It's all ultimately about
Even the Nazi books.
Uh-huh.
I wrote 3 books on the Third Reich. I mean, even there, I'm trying to point to what happened. Right? What happened? Why do we have these reactions that we have about fascism? Right? There's a reason, but we've forgotten the reason. We've become kind of distracted by the Hugo Boss outfits. We get distracted by things that we don't really pay attention to. But there's deeper things at work. And if we could understand that, we would be free of that as well. But we're not going to be until we get there, until we get to that point, until we come to terms with it. So the 3 books on that is to try to show people that there was a universal kind of Nazism, right? And they were fascinated with occultism. Some of them were, right? Himmler, most famously. So he ran an Ahnenerbe organization. This to me was fascinating because I didn't believe it existed. I wrote my first book on Holy Alliance from the point of view that I wanted to write a nonfiction version of The Morning of the Magicians, right? I loved that book, but it was half fantasy, and it was totally unsupported by documentation. So I wanted to know if any of that was really real. And when I was starting to write Sinister Forces, I said, let me go and check out this Nazi stuff because that could be relevant, right? So I'm looking at that, and I get invited. I invited myself to the Library of Congress and to the archives, the National Archives. And you have to go through a few hoops to get into the archives, but I wanted to see the captured German documents from the war. They had a bunch of microfilm. And I walked in there, and I told the archivist, a very well-known guy at the time, I asked him, I said, I'm looking for documents about this and about that, trying to word it gently so I didn't sound like a total kook. And the guy said, oh, you mean the SS Ahnenerbe? We have them all over here. So I said, cool, right? So I'm now scrolling through microfilm, and I'm looking at the Tibet expedition of 1938, the SS Tibet expedition of 1938. I'm looking at, how do we do yoga postures in the shape of runes, of Nordic runes? How do we develop a Kabbalah that's not Jewish? And on and on. I'm looking at all this stuff, and it's just masses of documentation.
That's wild.
A lot of them signed by Heil Hitler, by Heinrich Himmler, right? And I'm staring at this, and I'm thinking, how come nobody's writing about this? All these books on Nazi occultism, and nobody's looking at the real documents, the original papers.
Didn't they go to Mount Kailash looking for some underground civilization there?
Among other things, yeah. But they went all the way into Tibet, right? And they're measuring skulls with calipers, right? I have photographs of that.
So wild. And their fascination with Antarctica, right, came from Hyperborea, which was the first root race, if you look at kind of theosophy and Madame Blavatsky and stuff. Wasn't theosophy, like the swastika kind of came from theosophy, right? That they took on the Nazis?
Now you're back in my territory again. Okay. Yeah. As Unholy Alliance pointed out, the swastika was famously imprinted on Blavatsky's original books as the symbol of the Aryans. And the whole idea of the Aryans being the current spiritually advanced race, right, came from Blavatsky. And there was a group of militia in 1919. The war ended in 1918, World War I. There was the Russian Revolution. And then there was an almost communist takeover of Germany at the time. There was a lot of socialism, a lot of communism, different parties fighting each other. But the right-wing types were army veterans, right, who had fought against Russia during the First World War. So they formed independent militias, Freikorps, as they call them. And one of them was the Stahlhelm and the steel helmet, and on their helmets were emblazoned the swastikas. This was as early as 1918 and 1919. So there was an assassination of members of the Thule Gesellschaft on April 30th in 1919. Now, the Thule Gesellschaft was a German secret society, like we've been talking about, and they had the swastika as their symbol, right? This was long before Hitler showed up. So the swastika was their symbol, and it was a symbol of the Aryans, and they got that again from the Theosophical writings and pseudo-Theosophical writings, people copying Blavatsky. And so that was like, this was it. This is our symbol, the symbol of the Aryans. We're Aryans, you know. A lot of them would not have passed the blood test at the time, but they considered themselves Aryans. So these people were massacred on April 30th, Walpurgisnacht in Germany, and it led to this outcry among the right-wing groups. So the right-wing groups and the left-wing groups had this fight, this pitched battle in the streets of Munich. These were occultists fighting on the streets of Munich, right? It was bizarre, as if you had given the Golden Dawn machine guns and said, have at it, you know. It was just so strange, and that fascinated me. I said, this is weird. And what do we know about the Thule Gesellschaft? Not much. But the Library of Congress had a lot of information on it, as it turned out. So not just the archives, but the Library of Congress. So I had access to that information. And I'm going, oh my God, this was all going on. This was not made up, right? Powles and Bergier, who wrote Morning of the Magicians, they were kind of winging it a little bit. But it was based on something kind of real, you know, and this is, nobody was writing the truth about it. And I thought that was my job now. I've got access to this. And then I went to South America. That's another story. But this whole thing was, I wanted to put this out there as there is something. Yes, Virginia, there is, you know, a Nazi occult thing. There is a thing that Himmler was in charge of.
Yeah. And the Antarctica expedition was very real.
Right. Well,
and, you know, there's, I mean, the whole, if you look at like all the SS patches, they're all, you know, it's like
Right.
Black Sun. It's all this sort of occult symbology. So I think it's sort of hidden in plain sight and was clearly, you know, I mean, the Indiana Jones narrative of, you know, them looking
Right.
for the Ark of the Covenant maybe isn't so off. I guess the follow-up question to that, though, is like, what are the implications? Because there's some Occam's razor explanation that this is just, you know, the fascinations of you know, the ultimate hubris of this kind of, you know, Napoleon, Alexander the Great type,
Right.
the machinations of this sort of ridiculous, you know, mind of Hitler. And then there's some other explanation, which is maybe this conferred some sort of local power that would then blow up in the faces of the Nazis, because it was this Faustian bargain, but you know, they were drawing from some sort of non-human intelligence or something else. What do you think?
Well, yeah, all those points have been made, and I understand them, and I understand the resistance of academia to embrace this story, as they have reacted to it. But the documents don't lie. It's just a question: do you interpret them the same way? The Ahnenerbe was a real organization, and it was called Ancestral Heritage, because what Himmler was trying to do was completely remove Christianity and Judaism from the German people and replace it with a Nordic version, which meant a pagan version, which in the context of 1930s Germany meant basically an occult version, right? So they replaced the rituals of baptism, for instance, with a Nordic-style christening. They replaced the marriage rites with a Nordic-style marriage rite. They were deliberately trying to do this. So,
and wasn't Hitler writing poetry to the Nordic gods and as a soldier in World War I?
Yes, he was. He wrote it. They're reprinted in, I think it's Toland's biography of Hitler. So the poems are there. He was writing to Odin and Thor, right?
So, and okay, and then this is where things get very speculative and weird. But I mean, one of the constant sort of tropes in UFO stories, UFO abduction cases is the Nordics. It's always the Nordics, the Greys, or the reptilians.
Right.
The Nordics seem particularly interesting, powerful, like these sort of perfect humans or whatever. So do you think there was any sort of Nordic-Nazi relationship?
Okay. We have to define our terms. There's so many terms in that sentence. I don't know where to start. Nordic, Nazi, and relationship.
That goes beyond the Nazi fascination with Nordic mythology. You know what I mean?
I understand.
Yeah.
Okay, my short answer is no.
Okay.
But let me qualify what I'm
Mm.
saying. They were fascinated by it.
Mm.
Himmler was fascinated by this.
Mm.
In fact, they tried to prove there was an Aryan race all over the globe. They sent archaeologists looking everywhere for traces of swastikas wherever they could find them, thinking that was the key,
Mm.
right? And that comes from Blavatsky. I mean, give me a break, right? But
Mm.
it got lost in the sauce there as they went off on this tangent.
Mm.
So now they're saying, okay, this is we find the swastika in India. There must be an Aryan relationship there. We find it in China. It must be there. I've seen swastikas on buildings in Malaysia and Indonesia, but they're Buddhist symbols right there. So, but they were looking for this. They were looking for this proof. They had this was not a scientific process, right? They had the result they wanted. They're looking for stuff to confirm it. They didn't look for stuff that didn't confirm it, only for stuff that confirmed it. So here's the evidence that confirms our story. So this is part of the problem there. They wanted Nordic because they wanted to get rid of Christianity and Judaism. They had to get rid of Christianity because of Judaism, right? And they were against Judaism for whatever reasons they were against Judaism for. It was anti-Semitism was popular in Europe, all over Europe, Eastern Europe. I mean, the protocols of the Elders of Zion came out of Russia, right? So that started this whole thing. People believed it was true. So, the Jews are having a secret meeting and they're discussing the takeover of the world. So that document got published and it's still being published. It was published in South Africa all the time. Translations were published all over Asia. Translations published in South America, like this is a true thing. This is a meme now that's become true in the eyes of many people. I was asked about it at an academic conference in Indonesia, right? So, I mean, this stuff is there. I met a terrorist, the guy who created the Bali bombings in 2002. And he's telling me, it's the protocols of the Elders of Zion, like it's real. I'm telling him there's like 2 Jews in your entire country, right? You're not really suffering from a Jewish invasion. But anyway, that was his perspective, right? So this has become this thing. This has become a problem that we cannot get our way around because history has made it kind of real, even though it's not real. We know it was a hoax invented by the secret police in Russia during the time of the Tsar, even before the Soviet Union. So this whole thing becomes this problem, right? And the Nordics become the solution to this problem. We're really Aryans. We're really Nordics. We don't belong in this situation that we're in. We're in this, we lost the First World War. It must be because of the Jews. Can't be because of us. It can't be because of we extended ourselves in trying to invade Russia, for crying out loud. Napoleon could have told you not to do that, right? So all of these mistakes we made are not ours. They're somebody else's. So naturally, they want to make contact with their source. And they found their source in a guy called Weistor, Carl Willigut, right? Who claimed he had photographic memory of what it was like back in the day when there were only Nordics on the planet. Okay?
Whoa.
And Himmler gave him an officer in the SS. So he's in the SS along with all these other psychos, right? And he's giving all this stuff to Himmler. This is what I'm going into a trance now. I can see it. This is what happened at this time. This is what happened at that
And did
time.
he say it was like Hyperborea?
Yeah, really. It was Tula, right?
Whoa.
Right.
It's like Atlantis or
yeah. So they're buying it.
Whoa.
Right? And Himmler, 1 or 2 cards short of a deck, right? He builds Wewelsburg Castle, right? Which I went to and I did a TV thing like 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago for that. On that. That's a beautiful castle, but was in disrepair when Himmler took it over. He refurbished it with concentration camp labor, and he built basically a round table for his 12 knights to sit around and have seances, right? And bring down the spirits of the ancient Teutonic kings.
This is so crazy.
So they wanted to do this. The physical evidence is there. Swastikas in the floor, swastikas in the ceiling, the niches where they're going to put the urns of the deceased SS leaders,
But and then there's a question of, were they interacting with anything? And I think in your model reality, you would say yes.
Yes.
Right?
Sure.
And then who knows what it is.
But it could have been anything.
Yeah. It could be totally trickstery.
It could have been those guys from the Australian consulate telling us,
Well, simultaneous to that, you have these neo-pagan rituals that they all have to go through.
Right.
You had Werner von Braun going through these rituals. His mentor, Hermann Oberth, on record saying that non-human intelligence allowed them to build rockets to go to space, you know?
That's in Secret Machines, yep.
There you go.
Yeah.
And something else you get into with Secret Machines, which is fascinating, is there's always this question of like, is there some bizarre Nazi connection with Roswell itself and some of the early contactees? You talk about Adamski, George Hunt Williamson.
Sure.
Is there some sort of connection with some of these early UFO crashes in Nazi Germany, which, you know, by all kind of conventional historical accounts was over by 1945, and Roswell is 2 years later in 1947?
Well, is there a connection? I think so. I think we made a pretty good case for it in Secret Machines based on the information that we have. And that is something that people don't realize. We think of Operation Paperclip as a purely American phenomenon, which it was, but the Russians had their own version of Paperclip. And the Russians brought more than 3,000 scientists and their families into Russia, whether by force or, you know, hook or by crook, but they did. And they built an entire city. I believe it's in what is now Belarus, if not Ukraine. It's in the book also with a precise location. They built this operation there to renew all the experimental programs that have been going on at Peenemünde at Nordhausen to bring it all back to life again. And they got as many scientists and technologists and engineers, technologists as they could. And one of their programs, and it was revealed after the Soviet Union fell, some of this documentation became available, was to build a kind of flying saucer. And it was based on the Horton model. Now, the Horton model, you can find this on the internet everywhere. The diagrams are public information now, was a flying disc, but with the bottom, one side of it sort of chewed out. So it was kind of a C-shaped craft, the kind that Kenneth Arnold saw, you know, in 1947, the same design. Without him knowing, at the time he wouldn't have known that this was the design of the Horton craft. So the Hortons, the two brothers, one of which wound up in Argentina developing craft for Perón, and another wound up staying in Germany, and nobody seemed to want him for anything, for whatever reason. I think he was the test pilot for a lot of the Horton brothers' devices, so maybe he wasn't considered a technician or an engineer or a scientist. But there were enough Russian scientists that they could rebuild it and see if they could make it fly. So with 3,000 scientists in Russia, with Nazi presence all around the world after the war, it's a possibility, and I'll tell you why. And I was thinking to bring it with me, and I guess I didn't realize our conversation would go in this direction. And it's a good thing I didn't. It's a big, heavy thing. The U.S. Congress published in June of 1945, before the war in Asia was over, they published a report on basically what was the Maison Rouge meeting that happened in 1944 in Strasbourg. The SS had ordered the heads of German industry at a meeting. This was after the D-Day invasion, when the handwriting was on the wall, and they knew they were going to lose this thing one way or the other. They basically told the leaders of German industry to expatriate as much of their wealth, as much of their technology, necessary personnel as possible overseas to get it out of the hands of the Allies. Now, in June of 45, we already had this information, and they published it as part of the congressional record. It's this thick. It's at least 2 inches thick printed. And you're going through and you're looking at all the companies that the Germans had overseas, all of the industries they were involved in that they owned at that time, including a lot of real estate in South America, literal real estate, ranches, you know, haciendas, all sorts of places that they had bought in the years leading up to the end of the war. And then, in addition to that, we find when the Clinton administration ordered an investigation as to Nazi gold and what happened to the Nazi gold that was missing, they found just within a few months, because they didn't have a lot of financing to continue this for a long time, that committee only lasted a short while. They found 40 tons of gold that had been shipped out of the Bank of Lisbon by submarine. 20 tons went to Macau. Well, they all went to Macau. 20 tons went into China, and 20 tons went into Indonesia. That 20 tons of gold probably jump-started what Sukarno used to call the Revolutionary Fund, which was going to be an anti-IMF, anti-World Bank that he had planned for, that Hjalmar Schacht, Hitler's former finance minister, had asked Sukarno to do.
Whoa.
Okay, he had met Sukarno. He had been denazified, Schacht, and had wound up in Indonesia visiting Sukarno, saying you have to build an Islamic crescent to defend against Chinese communism. Right? And the best way to do that is start up your own fund, get all these other countries that are non-aligned with either China, Russia, or the United States, and have it based here in Jakarta.
Whoa. So is the implication that Roswell was Horton Brothers technology that might have gotten into Soviet hands?
It could be Soviet hands. It could have been somebody else's hands, because the Nazis had assets everywhere. Now, they didn't have assets to the kind you would think would develop, what we think was the prototypical flying saucer. The amount of, the problem is we don't know what a real flying saucer is, right?
Yeah.
All the reports that we have say there's no instrumentation, there's nothing in there.
It's really tricky because you do have real documented evidence that Hans Kammler was running this thing called Skoda Works from 1942 to 45 in Breslau and Pilsen, modern Czechoslovakia and Poland, and they were building what seemed to be saucers. Like Rudolf Schreiber, who was a technician there, said that one climbed to 40,000 feet in a few seconds. Richard Mita had all these plans for saucers. You had Victor Schauberger, very famously, this naturalist who claimed he had zero-point energy machines, and they were sort of saucer-shaped. I think it was called an impeller because it was like the centripetal, not centrifugal force. So it wasn't outward moving; it was inward moving, and it would cause sort of thrust as a result. And so you had all this evidence that they were working on things like that. You also have a book by this guy, British journalist named Tom Auguston, about this sort of great game dividing up of Skoda Works, of Kammlerstab, between the Soviets and the U.S. So we know that this was like of vital strategic importance. We also, I think now know, due to Air Force documents, that Kammler himself, who's this ruthless Nazi, I think Albert Speer, who was head of Nazi armaments, said, he was the most ruthless man I was ever forced to collaborate with. And you're talking about a guy who worked with Himmler and Goebbels and Hitler and so it's like has to be. I think that's
a high bar.
It is a high bar. I think Kammler had a plan to assassinate Hitler in the final days of the Third Reich. So crazy guy. So we know that there were real plans to build like this flying saucer. We don't know how far they got. And then Annie Jacobson writes about in her book Area 51 that there was this attempted, they really wanted to find the Horton brothers because they were building these sort of saucers.
Prototypes, yeah.
But then you also have people at Roswell, and they're like, a weird being with 3 or 4 fingers and toes came out of the craft and was definitely not human. And so those two things just don't line up or comport at all.
Obviously, there's disinformation somewhere. Yeah.
And so your bet would be the disinfo would be on the kind of NHI alien front, and that this might be prosaic human technology.
I think it's a possibility that what crashed in Roswell was human technology. Prosaic, I'm not sure.
Yeah, sure. Exotic human technology.
Exotic human, maybe.
Yeah.
But remember, when you're talking about Roswell and you're talking about Wright-Patterson, you're talking about all the Nazi scientists, Walter Dornberger from Peenemünde, his first posting was to Wright-Patterson. He was in Wright-Patterson when the Roswell debris